Good evening. This is the December meeting of the Glendale Civil Service Commission. We have a fairly robust agenda, and so we'll move forward with what I call due deliberate speed. And I believe that there is, once we have roll call, let's begin with roll call and then take the motion.
Commissioner Minuchin?
Yes.
Commissioner Carey?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Here.
Chair McCarley?
Here.
Mr. Chair, I ask that we move item number 6 up above the minutes so we can have the people who are doing the presentation leave right after the presentation if they need to.
Fellow Commissioners, is there any objection to that request to show recognition to our scholars and members of the Management Academy?
Not at all.
With that, it appears we have absolute consensus, and the chair, Mr. Recorder, if you could move forward with the recognition ceremony.
Presentation of Glendale Leadership Development Academy and Glendale Supervisory Academy, Class of 2019.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this item is a recognition of an event that was held today, the graduation for our two primary leadership development programs, the Glendale Supervisory Academy and the Glendale Leadership Development Academy. These are both extensive cohort training and development programs that are offered over the past year. The individuals who participated were all nominated by their respective department heads, and they represented pretty much every city department. And we were had a very enjoyable experience today, having the graduation ceremony. The Supervisory Academy graduated, I believe it was 24 employees this year, and the Glendale Leadership Development Academy had 15. And this is such a great program, very positive, that we always like to share with the Commission, the graduates, those who are willing to be here tonight and stay a little late. But if I may, Mr. Chair, have those individuals come up, introduce themselves briefly, and if the Commission has comments, that would be appropriate.
Would all the participants in the Management Academy and the Leadership Development Academy come forward for recognition? Don't be shy.
Introduce themselves.
We're not that terribly intimidating.
Go ahead.
I'm Alex Trecorn with the Glendale Police Department.
All right, see, police right front and center. Didn't even ask you to start. Hold on for just a second. I usually go left to right. That's sort of a sequence here. And we will begin on, ma'am? You come right up. Just give your name and your position within the city and participation in either the Management or the Leadership Academy.
The Glendale Supervisory. My name is Lynn Nagel, and I work with Building and Safety.
Thank you. And any comments? Was it a great experience, valuable?
Yes, it was very
Make
good.
you a far more important and valued contribution
No, it
an
was very
employee to the city.
informative. Yes.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Good evening. I'm Christy Bauta. I'm the Employee Health Coordinator with the City of Glendale. I work in HR. The program was really beneficial, and I look forward to the leadership program.
Excellent. Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening. Veronica Chavez, Paralegal, City Attorney's Office. And I think it was a very great experience for me, other than the fact that I'm already in the legal field, but there's always a lot more to learn from. And this really helped me out for the reason being, of course, working in the City Attorney's Office and handling the files more appropriate.
Thank you.
Good evening. Gloria
Hello.
Melendez, Executive Assistant to the City Council. I work in Management Services, and I enjoyed it. It was a great opportunity. It was great for me. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Hello?
Hi,
evening.
Vista Zaddy. I'm a planner. I work in CDD planning. I enjoyed it a lot. It was very informative and good experience. Thank you.
Appreciate your participation.
Thank you.
Sir?
Hello. Greg Kaijo, the Department of Innovation, Performance, and Audit.
It was a great opportunity. Thank you to the city. Thank you to you guys for the opportunity.
Lieutenant, I think you were front center.
I jumped the gun.
You
but,
did, but
That's
that's
my fault. I asked
That's
him
all
to
right.
come in.
representative of our fine police department.
Thank you very much. Alex Krikorian, I'm with the police department. It was a great opportunity to connect with people from different departments and get a perspective that's not law enforcement. So it's a really, really good opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Good evening. I'm Adam Poliasoto. I'm Network Manager with the Information Services Department. And it was a great experience, and I really appreciate the investment in the staff.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luis Moreno. I'm the help desk supervisor. I participated in the Glendale Supervisor Academy. It was very enjoyable. I like all the tips, and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening.
Good evening. My name is Armene Jimenez. I'm an executive analyst with the Information Services Department. I really enjoyed the program and mostly enjoyed networking with other leaders in the city. Thanks.
Appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Milka Khan, and I really enjoyed the leadership program. It really certainly useful here in the department. I'm one of the senior planners here in the planning division, so I look forward to continue moving along and providing leadership for all in the organization.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say something absolutely inappropriate. I expected you to have a negative comment because you being the last, but that does certainly point out the tremendous value of these particular programs sponsored by the city. It demonstrates the competency of our fine employees, their eagerness to learn, and the development of leadership skills that will last long into the future. So as chair, I commend your success in the program and thank you for your participation.
Congratulations.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair, we sometimes forget the people who put this program together, so Matt Doyle and the staff should be really get a lot of praise for what they do. It's not something very easy. It's not something you put together in a day or two. It takes a lot of time, effort, staffing. The city allows this to happen. The city manager supports it, and Matt and the staff do a great job. So if we can hear it from Matt and his staff.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, if I can say thank you. And whenever I get a compliment, I need to give due credit to the people that actually do the work on these things, and that would be Miss Amy Martin, my assistant department head. Ando Bardanian, Human Resources Associate. I think he's here. And thank you, Commissioner Abkarian, for being at the luncheon today.
And graduates, you're welcome to remain and follow our proceedings.
Or you're welcome to leave.
Or you're welcome to leave. That's permission. You will not make us in any way upset and revoke your certifications. So
we have to stay. You don't.
All right.
Congratulations, Milka.
Thank you again. And with that, we will return to the agenda.
Minutes for the meeting of November 13, 2019.
Move to approve. Dispense from reading.
Second.
All in favor? Oh, I'm sorry. Jumped the gun on you.
We have a first and a second, and I believe Chair McCarley was not here last meeting. So
That is true. I must abstain.
Perfect. Commissioner Minuchin?
Yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Gazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Abstain. And our agenda item number 3, oral communications. I do not see any cards seeking public comment. So without cards, we will move forward to agenda item number 4.
Recruitment and examination report.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is a note and file item, but this is our monthly recruitment and examination status report. Has all of our current recruitment activities by job title, department, whether it was a open or promotional recruitment process, filing period, dates of exams. It appears that we have approximately 48 recruitments in process. It's I think that's down a bit from last month, but again, it's a continual flow of work that the staff is doing in this area. And if you have questions on this item, I'd be happy to try and answer them for you. Otherwise, this is a note and file.
Commissioners, seeing no questions, we'll proceed to number 5.
Eligible list established.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, this too is a note and file item. This is the eligible lists that have been established since our last meeting. Again, a lot of activity you're seeing, particularly for a month with a lot of holidays. But we did complete 15 lists during that month, 7 open processes, 7 promotional, and 1 promotional and open. Again, very much ongoing, very busy workload for the staff. But as you can see from the lists, a lot of good lists have been established, and for the service of each of our departments. So, again, if you have any questions on any of these, I'd be happy to answer them. Otherwise, this is a note and file.
Seeing no, one comment from Commissioner.
So, I have a question for you. There's 2 police officer recruit, 8,600 and 8,560. It looks almost identical. I just can't tell the difference between them. One has 318 total applicants. The other one has 323. Can you tell me the difference between them?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Abkarian, those are 2 separate recruitment processes. Commission may be aware that we're doing the recruit process on a regular basis every other month, approximately, and that represents 2 consecutive recruitment processes. One of them, the establishment of the list, lagged a few weeks and ended up on this report along with the one that followed. So really, that amounts to about 2 months of activity each one, and it's just 2 consecutive recruitment processes for the recruit on the same report.
So does that suggest that we now have, if I added 21 and 15, 36 eligibles?
For those 2,
for that
that's
category.
That's correct.
Same requirements, no difference.
Absolutely.
Just sequenced by month.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Yes,
On
Mr.
the
Vine.
8602, where we had the recruit for the police officer, the English Armenian showed 47 applications received. 1 made it to the list. Would you know if that happened, that dropout, the 46 people dropped out because they just didn't continue with the process, or did they actually fail part of the examination process?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Devine, I don't have the specific numbers on that, but my sense is a good portion of that simply would represent those who didn't show up to the examination process. And I don't know, maybe Sean Chavez here, if he has any further information on that. But we do get a lot of no-shows. I mean, with the ease of applying online, I always harken back to the good old days when you actually had to prepare an application, fill it out, mail it, or bring it in. Nowadays, it's all done on the click of a button, and we do have a high no-show rate. But my assumption would be probably half of the applicants showed and went through the process.
Yes, that's correct, Commissioner Devine. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me either, but just for instance, we did an examination this past weekend. We had 350 invited and 78 showed up to test. So we do lose a lot just from attendance issues, but then also there probably were more that showed up, more police officer recruit Armenian candidates that did show up for that process. They go through the physical agility test, the written examination, and the oral interview, and then that number is reflected after they have passed all those processes. So there probably were a few more that participated in the process, and the result was just the one that ended up being successful.
So that does include the physical agility portion of it?
Correct. Yeah, this is the end result of those that have been successful in the selection process for those positions.
Okay.
But they haven't passed background.
That's correct. Yeah.
But you have that granularity, that data someplace. If
Yes, we
it's
do.
some
Yeah.
later period.
Yeah, if
of
it
time
was
you wanted
requested,
to
we could
take a
provide that
look
to you.
at it. But it is a significant degradation in the numbers that applied and the numbers that actually found themselves on the eligible list. But again, that's the same discussion we've had repeatedly If you look at the police recruit, 8,600 and 8,560, once again, we're down below 10%.
Yeah, definitely half the battle is just getting them to show up after
Yes.
they apply.
Certainly understand, and at one point, we'll ask the chief, maybe in a couple of months, to come back and review the recruitment process and progress and challenges, as he does every year. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, while we're on the subject, I would invite the commission, if they're ever interested in observing the testing process that we do, you're always welcome. Just contact my office, and we'd be happy to have you observe. I happen to have observed this past weekend's one, and we typically, or in the past, we had done the physical, written, everything separate, and now it's all sort of done at the same time. And we do the physical agility is probably the most labor intensive, and that's actually done here on site on the weekends. We more or less close our parking garage and have the candidates do their various iterations within the parking garage, and there's staff observing them, and it's a very interesting process. So if you're ever interested, ever free on a Saturday or Sunday morning, let us know. We'd be happy
On the
to.
record, I accept that invitation. So I'll see it in my email. Thank you.
I love what you guys did with the agility test. It's the way you've changed it. It's very interesting. And I think it's point on. Good work.
All righty, well, we'll press forward with the hard work of the commission, beginning with agenda item 7.
Class specification for approval, wireless communication series.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, in the last year or so, we've made a concerted effort to review classifications within our information services department to make sure that these titles, duties, and job requirements are up to date and contemporary. You've seen a lot of Mr. Bradford over the past few months. In the IT field, these specifications really ought to be updated every 3 to 5 years at minimum, and I'd say we have challenges meeting that frequency. However, in this series, the wireless employees in this series have to do the maintenance and repair and the fixed, mobile, portable wireless equipment systems. Really, the work that these individuals do touch nearly every department that uses equipment and radios, the largest being police, fire, Verdugo, and ISIS. In this situation, for this report, we're proposing reduction in the required years of experience at the more entry-level classifications within this series, simply for a number of reasons, but mainly to assist in our recruitment efforts. Right now, the entry position in this is requiring 3 years of experience, and we're finding that that's A, it's not industry standard, and B, it's inhibiting us from our ability to hire really strong candidates who may not have 3 years. So that, along with a variety of other updates to this series, is what's before you. So if you have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Mr. Bradford is here, as are several of his staff members. And
we look forward to hearing from Mr. Bradford. That's almost consistent every month. Come forward, sir. Any questions from other members of the commission regarding this particular position? I do. I saw one of the requirements for an FCC general radio technician license. Now, having struggled through that is quite an effort to secure that licensing. Is that an absolute? It appears, because you remove the term desirable, and so I would assume that that's a requirement.
Chair McCarley, members of the commission, that is correct. You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah, that's
precisely correct.
Makes it somewhat restrictive.
It can make it a challenge to recruit.
But the nature of this job bulletin is really related to the radios. I mean, I know exactly what you mean about, but I think having that license would be bare minimum for that field. And are you guys ever going to change the name ISIS? I know.
It's a great question. It actually has been renamed to ICIS.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are all the techs at the present point in time licensed that are working for you?
Yes.
And that's appreciated. We're not in any way trying to make modifications. And once again, we're trying to facilitate your acquisition of personnel that can satisfy the needs of the city. And so we sometimes focus on these license requirements. You fully explain the prerequisite. I suspect that because they, once repaired, will go on the airwave and conduct some sort of test or actual communications, that license is a prerequisite to hitting that, as we used to say when I took it, Morse code key. Now, of course, it's a lot more sophisticated.
Correct.
Thank you.
And I think they've added that the major electronic components of it, that's what makes the test a little bit harder.
Thank you.
Thank you. Move to approve?
Just one more question, I'm sorry. The wireless system technologist, the senior wireless system technician, it says public administration as one of the requirements for education. I can understand the electrical engineering, computer science, but why public administration? If you're a wireless system technician, why would you need to have a public, and how does that qualify you in being why would that be part of the requirement as an education?
Commissioner Abakarian, members of the commission, we're trying to look for the broadest pool of candidates that we can. We have a hard time finding qualified candidates. Public administration is generally acceptable for all the positions. A lot of positions that we recruit here at the city, typically they have other qualifying experience in addition to their educational background. In talking with my wireless systems manager and HR, we felt that public administration was appropriate for this classification.
Due to more of a supervisorial set of responsibilities.
Correct.
But he can still, or she can still touch that key and send forth a signal into the cyber world. Thank you.
But the way I read it, it just says desirable.
That's
right?
correct.
It's not a requirement.
I understand that.
Okay.
I'm just saying that I just didn't connect the dots. So.
Got it.
Appreciate it. You know how much we enjoy conversing with you.
I'm sure I'll
You
be
are
back
at
in
the
the
cutting edge of the employee technology movement forward.
Was there a motion? I second the motion.
Commissioner Manukian?
Yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Gazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Yes. Following agenda.
Job bulletin for approval. Fire engineer. My apologies. Class specification and job bulletin for approval. Assistant fire marshal.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, this too is a class specification and job bulletin for approval for Assistant Fire Marshal. This class specification and revision is seeking approval in order for us to also post an open bulletin for the Assistant Fire Marshal position once the specification is updated. And this spec is in dire need of updating. It's been since 2003, and it's one of those things that should have happened probably years ago. But obviously, there have been a lot of changes since 2003 in the fire prevention and environmental compliance regulations. There are a lot of references that have been added to this specification to something called the Certified Unified Program Agency, CUPA, which is Glendale is a CUPA agency, and we've actually been so for many, many years. But I believe when this spec was last put together, there were not any references to that. So it's a key part of this job, as well as the updated specification. When this spec is ready to be posted, we do hope to do an open bulletin, and that's part 2 of this action, would be to request an open bulletin, because I believe years ago, last time we filled this, it was done promotionally, and we believe they're a limited pool internally, thus requesting the open process. So with that, Chief Lanzas is here, as well as Battalion Chief Jeff Ragusa, who's the fire marshal.
I would ask the chief to come forward. And I'll look first to my fellow commissioners for any comments or questions.
I have a question.
Mr. Gazarian.
Good evening, Chief.
Good evening.
Why is this a non-sworn management
classification?
So all the staff in the, good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, Sylvia Alonso, Fire Chief, sorry about that. All of our positions in the fire marshal's office, except for the fire marshal himself, are non-sworn positions. They're all civilian positions. Our assistant fire marshal, who just recently retired after 28 years here in the city, was also a non-sworn. So there's no change in that classification.
So forgive my ignorance. You're the fire chief, right?
Yes, sir.
So you're above the fire marshal in terms of responsibility or ultimate accountability.
Yes, sir.
But the fire marshal is a sworn position, correct?
That is correct.
So if the fire marshal is absent and the assistant fire marshal steps in to fill the need in times of need, is there any issue in your mind or no issue that that person is a non-sworn personnel?
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, Commissioner Gazarian, it's a great question. The majority of fire marshals are actually non-sworn.
Oh.
The large majority.
But our city is. Or is it our city also sometimes it's not?
No, across the industry.
Yeah.
There are many fire marshals that are non-sworn.
Okay.
We have a sworn fire marshal because of the lack of number of chief officers in our ranks. It gives us the depth of resources at the chief officer level that allows me, if we have a big fire, to utilize that resource also in the chief officer role. Okay.
All right, thank you.
But majority of times they deal with the inspections and
And the assistant fire marshal is then to be very cautious the next step, not within the chain of command, the operational chain of command.
That's correct. He's not in the operational chain of command. He reports to the fire marshal in the Fire Prevention Bureau.
Now, in the case of a multi-class fire, it is possible that the chief fire marshal would in fact command an engine, command a battalion.
Our fire marshal is a battalion chief, a sworn employee
Yes.
who has chain of command and has the training, knowledge, experience, and authority to take command of an incident. The assistant fire marshal would not.
That's fine. And then one question that we have to raise is a decision that you're proposing or brought forth to us, and that is in lieu of a promotion, to make this an open procurement. And I know our recorder has come back and indicated that there is a dearth of qualified personnel within the department who can rise to the occasion.
Mr. Chairman and members of the commission, we feel that there is a small number of qualified candidates within the Bureau. We do have several that we do feel may be qualified or will be qualified and may apply, but we want to open the pool openly just to, again, bring in the most qualified and look at it from totality view instead of only from within.
And that could mean that a present assistant fire marshal with LA City Fire could apply. That would be the only type of individual who would have the prerequisites to submit an application.
Correct. There's quite a few people in other bureaus and working for other fire departments in the Fire Prevention Bureau that may qualify and would likely apply.
Now, I'm not sure of the answer. I usually try to know the answer before I ask the question, but in this instance, have there been instances in which a sworn member of your department has in fact accepted a transfer or a promotion to the assistant fire marshal position?
Prior to the civilianizing, if you would, of the Fire Prevention Bureau, there were sworn members in the Bureau. There were engineers that served in the inspector role.
Yes.
That's been some time since that was that way. I want to say the greater part of 15 years since that's been that makeup. So we have never had anybody sworn at the assistant fire marshal level that I'm aware of.
Okay. Is there any, to use this, pent-up interest that you sense or your command staff senses among the rank and file or those within who have the qualifications, who are sworn, to make that walk or crosswalk to assistant fire marshal? Because that is a significant position.
But this doesn't preclude them from, I mean, if you're a sworn fire individual, you could still apply,
That's the question.
or no?
You could apply if you're sworn and meet the qualifications, but likely that wouldn't happen because you would lose your safety. You would lose your sworn status.
But if you wanted to, you could.
Surely.
Yeah.
Or assuming you've reached that pensionable age and you can make that decision.
Nobody from within our organization would do that because it would change your pension.
Okay.
But somebody from another organization, like you described, an LA City employee,
LA City,
who's part of a different pension system,
True.
could certainly come here as a prior sworn employee, meeting the qualifications, and apply.
And I've seen that you have submitted this to the Glendale Management Association for its review.
Okay, move to approve.
Second. Commissioner Menuchyan?
Yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Approved. Thank you. Thank you. Chief, you might not be off the hook. We have one more.
Job bulletin for approval, fire engineer.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, this is a job bulletin, not a specification for approval for the position of fire engineer. And I do want to alert you to a slight amended version of this, which was put at at the dais, referencing a paramedic certification or license as a optional option to the EMT requirement, which was somewhat of an afterthought, but it seemed to apply as well. This is, again, a safety promotional position, thus it requires Civil Service Commission approval. This bulletin is consistent with the approved class spec for fire engineer. There's one unique aspect of this exam is that those candidates who do pass the written examination process are going to advance, the ones who advance to a performance exam are going to participate in a 2-week academy prior to the performance exam where they sort of do the fine-tuning of their skills on the various apparatus that they would have to be able to master as a fire engineer. I'll probably ask Chief Lanzas to describe that process because it's somewhat new and different, but we think it's a good idea.
Yes, Mr. Chair, members of the commission, we chose to change the order of the process. What happened previous to this bulletin was that we had a written exam, we did a manipulative test, and then those who were successful in each of those went on into an academy. We did that in 2018. We had 5 individuals who were successful who went into our academy. All 5 have since been promoted. What we're doing is aligning more with the industry standard. The engineer examination, the engineer classification is one of many challenges. Throughout the fire service, there are challenges with people being interested, people being qualified in the promotion to engineer. So what we're doing is you will take the written test, we will take the top 12 scores of that written, put you into the 2-week academy, teach you the right way to be an engineer, all the tools, trades, and then at the end of the academy, test you and rank in that order. I myself went to a 6-week engineering academy in the department that I came from. It was a very in-depth, driving, pumping, apparatus maintenance, all the facets that come with being an engineer. So we will have an abridged version of that in a 2-week academy. We think this will help us, certainly will help us with the interest to promote. I met with every member of the department last week for fire chief's inspection and announced this potential change in the process, and there was a lot of interest within the organization of people expressing the interest because the test is difficult, and so this will help people hopefully be more successful in the process and in turn produce a better engineer out of the academy.
Any questions from commissioners? I think I have one or two, and this is as much educational for me and hopefully for others. Is the fire engineer position the second step in a career ladder that begins with fire officer?
Good question, Mr. Chairman. So in our organization, you don't have to be an engineer to go from firefighter to captain.
That is valuable.
You can go from firefighter to captain without being an engineer. I'll tell you, it doesn't happen too often. It takes a certain individual. I do believe there's benefits to being an engineer first. You become the right-hand person for that fire captain. You are the second set of eyes looking forward in the fire engine. You're the second set of eyes looking out for everybody on that crew. You immediately upon becoming an engineer can move up to being an acting captain. So there is a progression and a ladder to that position that I think brings great benefit. But there are, in the smaller organizations, there is the potential to go from firefighter to captain.
Sure. Now, to merge some actions that took place even before your appointment as our chief of our great department, I believe that we approved a requirement that firefighters also train and reach status as paramedics. Now, that I believe now is across-the-board obligation. So if I opted to test in order to be accepted as a firefighter, I would need to have a EMT 2P.
Good question again. So the last two recruitments and the current recruitment that we have for lateral open as we speak is only seeking paramedics. Because of our model with 2 paramedics assigned to every fire company, we are only hiring fire paramedics. We do still currently have 8 firefighters in the organization that are EMT level. The challenge is that they're only able to work on our ladder companies, our ladder trucks, not on our paramedic engines. So our ultimate goal is to get those 8 individuals to paramedic school. That is one of my goals that I've set. But we have to get fully staffed in order to send those individuals to
The
school.
only reason I bring that up, and perhaps it's the result of my own inability to read level of detail, but it does require as a license certification here as an EMT, just a EMT 1 alpha. It almost is, I would almost presume that as we are moving forward and requiring that all of our firefighters be EMT 2s, that requirement be incorporated in this particular job bulletin.
So again, I think that's the point that that Mr. Doyle made, was we made one last-minute change to the requirements where we added paramedic.
Good.
Because we still have those 8 who are firefighter who can qualify as EMTs, we added paramedic. The technicality of it is you can't be a paramedic without having been an EMT. So a paramedic is higher than EMT, so you still would have qualified if you're a paramedic. But just to be clear, we added the paramedic language to the bulletin in the last edit.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Move to approve?
Commissioner Manukian?
Yes.
Commissioner Karian?
Yes.
Commissioner Gazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Approve.
Thank you.
Thank you. And one final bulletin.
Job bulletin for approval, Library Arts and Culture Administrative Manager.
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, this is a bulletin for approval, Library Arts and Culture Administrative Manager. This is sort of a recent development. We have a recent resignation that occurred a few weeks ago, and we're seeking to recruit for this position. This is a position that handles more or less the administrative and business-related functions within the library department. The biggest of those being budget, personnel, those types of things. We are seeking an open recruitment process to broaden the pool. I will say we've done similar recruitments for similar positions throughout the city in the past 2 years, and I think we've more or less tapped a lot of the really experienced budget and administrative staff within the organization. Thus, we're seeking to broaden that pool by going to the outside. This is, again, a request for an open bulletin and requires commission approval. If you have questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them. And our library director is here, Gary Schaefer. Do you have any questions of him?
Well, as is our, or at least my view of things, we should ask the director to come forward. Thank you. Give him an opportunity to justify an open procurement rather than promoting from within.
Good evening, Mr. Chair.
Good evening.
members of the
Thank you for
commission.
coming on up.
You bet. Gary Schaefer, Director of Library Arts and Culture. So we actually are not aware of anyone within the department that has the skill set to fulfill this position. As Mr. Doyle said, it includes budget, but it's also facilities. We have a 95,000 square foot main library as well as 7 other library buildings. It includes security, it includes contracts, working with legal, and we simply don't have anyone at the library right now that could fulfill those items.
I certainly appreciate that explanation. Now, it begs a question, and it's not trying in any way to be controversial, is I've always looked at these at a certain management level as if a manager in one department, that manager can find herself serving under you in your department. That there's certain fundamental skills as a senior manager, for instance, budget generation, coordination, assumption of responsibilities, experience in the public administration domain, working with employees, motivating those employees. Now, there are, I would acknowledge certain specific skills related to library science that perhaps somebody from the police department who just felt that it was an appropriate time to move from the police department, or finance would probably be more appropriate, finance or the Office of Administration, or HR for that matter, to go to your department. So.
Well, I agree with you and was always taught if I wanted a promotion, I should train my replacement. So it is unfortunate that we don't have anyone.
That's our only concern. You're not going to see any pushback on this. It's just a commentary that we want to encourage as many as possible to apply, so you have a strong pool from which you can pick one of your most senior leaders. Thank you.
Move to approve.
Second.
Commissioner Manukian?
Yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Gazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Yes, approve.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Number 11, sir.
Report on the formation of oral interview panels and the use of internal raters on said panels.
And I believe Mr. Doyle will provide us with a briefing.
Yes, sir. Members of the commission, I'll give an overview of my report. It's somewhat lengthy, but I'd like to get through it, and then obviously if there's questions, further discussion afterwards, be happy to entertain those. Really, this report was requested by the commission earlier this year. Commissioner Devine requested this report mainly on how the interview panels are formed, and specifically wanted some further dialogue relative to the use of internal city employee raters on certain promotional selection processes. And I'm going to frequently use the term raters, and I hope you understand that we're talking about those who are selected to serve on these panels. So if that term is confusing, I apologize, but that's a term used in the HR field. That's sort of the jargon. In addition to the discussion of the interview panels, Commissioner Abkarian also asked for some information on really the method of scoring interview processes. So I hope to cover all of those various areas to your satisfaction. Members of the commission, we use oral interview panels for most of our recruitment processes, even if we rely heavily on other components of those processes, such as a written or a practical exam or even a typing test or something along those lines. Pretty much every recruitment process I can think of would conclude with some type of a structured oral interview process before a panel of subject matter experts. The civil service rules actually do address and recognize the use of oral interview panels and are somewhat instructive on how they should be utilized. I say that because the charter and civil service rules tend to be very broad in areas when it comes to these types of testing procedures. And I think over the years, various commissions, past and present, have requested that we bolster this section of the rules, which we have done so numerous times. For the process of or the process of putting together or designing an exam and selection process, for the most part, is a partnership between my department and the operating department. When we have a recruitment to do, again, myself, my staff members work with those departments in putting together an appropriate testing process that's obviously, fair, valid, open, objective, and certainly job related. And this certainly all applies when we're putting together and assembling oral interview panels and forming our interview panels. Those selected to those panels need to have a good knowledge base and experience in the subject matter, and really be able to provide an insightful perspective on the candidates being interviewed. Typically, the people that we select for these panels are a level or two above the position being recruited for, either a supervisory or a managerial capacity, and that's and obviously they need to have some degree of experience in that field. I say we rely heavily on the departments because the departments, the operating departments, are in fact the subject matter experts on their on the particular area, whether it be civil engineering or firefighting or the library field. We do rely heavily on them in putting this process together. However, as I'll say over and over again, the HR department is responsible for putting the selection process together and making sure that that process is done in a fair, open, and objective fashion. When we do a recruitment process, the planning begins weeks, sometimes months in advance. It's important to note that when we're talking about assembling the interview panels, it is the HR department's responsibility for procuring interview panelists. When we seek interview panelists or raters from the outside, from other agencies, that's done through my staff. I have operational staff that will contact other cities, other agencies. It could be county government, it could be a special district, so long as they have something that would be beneficial as far as helping us in that particular process. That process is one that is hopefully reciprocal. We'll ask the city of Pasadena or the city of San Gabriel or the city of San Fernando for raters at times, and we do that with the hope that if or with the expectation that if they were to ask us, we would try and help them as well. When it comes to seeking internal raters from within the organization, typically that's handled directly by my staff. They contact the individual in that particular department or the individual supervisor or department head to see if that person would be available to assist us. I want to make it clear in full disclosure that there are times when the operating department that we're working with will make a recommendation for our interview panels, either specific agencies to solicit or even specific individuals from those agencies that they would feel would be an effective choice for guiding us in that process. And we certainly do listen to that. We accept those recommendations. However, I want to make it clear it is my staff, my analysts that would make that contact with those individuals, reach out to those individuals, and pretty much all of the communication between the time that we solicit those individuals and the time that they actually come in to the on the day of the interviews is handled by my staff, either through correspondence, letters, or emails and such. Typically, and at this point I'll go into the process. I'm trying to do this as orderly as possible, and as far as both the planning and the establishment of the interview panel and the process itself. But the day of the interview process, and we typically try to schedule these so they occur all in one day. Sometimes on very large recruitments, we may have to have multiple days, but as you might expect, that can be somewhat challenging to get interview raters for more than one day. but they'll come to our organization, and typically they'll arrive in the morning, and we'll do what's a very extensive briefing of that process. And the briefing typically begins with the HR department staff member, one of my staff members, whether it's Sean Chavez or Manyo Nanian, one of those folks, will meet with the raters, and they'll go over the instructions, the process itself, how many applicants there were, how many made the cut initially, how many they'll be interviewing, and those types of things. At that point, I'll deviate a little bit and talk about the conflict of interest questionnaire that is handed out at that time, and that's in your packet as attachment 1. And the conflict of interest questionnaire is designed to identify and address any potential conflicts between the candidates and the raters. This questionnaire specifically asks about any prior professional, supervisory, financial, or personal relationships with the candidates. And those things are gone over in discussion well before the interviews even begin. And the raters are asked to fill this out, sign their name to it. If there are any potential conflicts of interest, it's up to my staff and their judgment to make that determination of whether there needs to be someone recusing themselves in that process. Conversely, again, to further deviate, I do want to say when the candidates come in and they approach our front counter, in the Human Resources Department, we have the names, the job titles, and the organization of each of the raters posted in the lobby for the candidates' review prior to their interview. So they can actually see the names of the people that will be conducting those interviews and the organizations that they belong to. So both the candidate and the raters do have the ability to look and see and explore with my staff whether or not there could be a potential conflict of interest. And if the case occurs that there is one, or in the judgment of our staff, then there's a recusal process that we believe would protect the city and provide appropriate safeguard from potential conflicts. Getting back to the briefing itself, again, those are some of the main components of that briefing. And the briefing is not something to be taken lightly. It takes anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. After the HR staff member is done talking with the raters, then we will have the operating department come in, and everyone's in the same room together, and the operating department, again, being that they're the subject matter experts on the job itself, can provide their perspective on the job, answer any questions as far as some of the technical technical aspects of that job, and more or less address to the interview panel what characteristics, what traits, what abilities that they're looking for in the individuals that ultimately get interviewed and make it onto the list. So once the briefing is completed, we then have the operating department staff member leaves, and typically we don't see them again to the end of the day. My staff does not stay in the room the whole time for all of our recruitments. On some we do have somebody present, but all the interviews are tape recorded, and that's actually a requirement of our civil service rules. And the staff member who is coordinating that process is going to be there again, not necessarily in the room, but they'll be in the vicinity of the department in case there's any questions, problems, or concerns that arise throughout the day. And so the day progresses, and then at the end of the briefing, obviously, and as the interviews ensue, I at this point can talk a little bit about the scoring and how that more or less works. But really, throughout the day, the raters are expected to take notes as they're interviewing, and we typically don't ask them to finalize their scores or anything until they've seen at least a few candidates and have the ability to gauge the candidates' abilities in comparison to one another. typically the rating sheets and the forms are officially completed at the end of the day. And I have provided an example in attachment 3 of a typical rating sheet. This one is for one that we did a few months ago for Verdugo Fire Manager, and the rating sheets have essentially key dimensions. They're typically anywhere from 6 to 10 dimensions of that particular job, and those are the key attributes that we're looking for when we examine these employees, and then these candidates. And then there are numerical ratings for each of those specific dimensions on a scale of 1 through 6. And there's from the 1 being the lowest to 6 being the highest, and then there's an area at the bottom where they can make comments. And we do insist that that the raters do make comments, particularly if they're going to rate someone really well, or if they're going to fail someone, rate somebody low. It's almost a mandate that we want to see, because the candidates are always allowed after the fact to get feedback and see, gee, I failed this exam, why, what feedback can you provide? And the rating forms enable us to assess their strengths and weaknesses in the various dimensions, as well as whatever comments the interview panelists may have had. As far as the rating sheet itself, as you can see, there's a scale of 1 through 6 for each dimension, and there's a rating scale definitions go through that, and essentially the numerical value of 3 is what we are calling minimally acceptable. That's a minimum passing for the candidates, and obviously the 6 would be the highest score. So after this is all said and done, we have to take these rating sheets, we average them together, add them up, and convert a raw score to a numeric to a percentage score. And just to simplify this as much as I can, if someone were to get an average of all 3s, that would be enough to pass them on that process. All 3s would amount to essentially a score of 70%, which is a passing score. Obviously, somebody who gets all 6s would have a score of 100%, and anything in between that would be somebody who'd pass the process, but have something between 70 and 100. A candidate that has averages below 3, meaning a majority of 1s and 2s, or even 2s and 3s, that would probably put them below the pass point and cause them to fail the process. I do point out the last dimension in the rating sheet, overall likelihood of success, and that is a sort of a summary evaluation of the candidate. And if a candidate gets a failing score, or collectively a failing score in that particular dimension, that would be sufficient to fail them on the process. And we don't find this a lot, but it's very often if a candidate is going to fail, they're going to fail in a number of different dimensions. But you do have some candidates that are really, they score very well in some dimensions and very poorly in others, or they score very well in some dimensions, yet there's some sort of a fatal flaw that occurs throughout the interview. They make some inappropriate comment, they give a really poor answer, or exhibit some really poor judgment to some degree, and collectively the group may decide, irregardless of how they score in some of the other dimensions, to fail them from that regard. So that can occur. And again, during the end of the day, when there's a debriefing, these are the things that are sorted out between the raters and my staff at the debriefing. And I'll talk a bit about the debriefing as well. As I said earlier, we encourage the raters to not necessarily finalize their scores until at least midway through the day, and certainly to the end. And when my staff comes in at the end of the day, they discuss the candidates, the strengths, weaknesses, and we try to make sure that there's some alignment between their evaluations. If I were to see one rater give someone all 6s and another rater give the same candidate, all ones and twos, then that's some type of a flaw in that process. And from a statistical standpoint, it's not valid, and it's something that really it's the staff's job to sort that out as to what has occurred in that instance. And ultimately, a candidate or a rater may see something that they didn't see before when considering this, and there may be some consideration of changing their scores, but ultimately that's all done between the raters themselves, and ultimately when they're comfortable finalizing their ratings, they go ahead and complete this rating sheet that you've seen in attachment 3. They sign it, they hand it over to my staff, and that pretty much concludes that part of the process. We do allow the operating department reps to come in at that point, because they certainly have a right to know how how this turned out. They're curious. They want to see. They want to find out what occurred, and ultimately we share the tentative results. But again, at that point, we tell them that it's preliminary, it's confidential at this point, but don't discuss this with anyone. And the reason we say that is because there is a 3-day appeal period prior to the scores being released. And the purpose of that, and that's set forth in the rules, it's one of the most significant aspects of our civil service protections, is that if an employee does, I keep saying an employee, a candidate does believe some aspect of that process is either invalid or non-job related, or if a question was asked that was unfair or biased, they would have the ability to contact my staff within 3 days of the administration of that interview process and appeal that process. And we hold off on any scoring, any finalizing of the scoring in the lists until any appeals that are received are actually reviewed and considered. Assuming there are no appeals, and it's not terribly common to have appeals, we do release those scores 3 business days after the process is done, and they get the results. We now email them to the candidates. If they pass, they get a score, again between 70 and 100%, and a ranking on the eligible list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever the case may be. The candidates that don't attain a passing score are informed that they were not successful in passing the process, and all of those scores go out at the same time. So that's more or less the day of the examination process. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about utilizing internal raters, and there's been a lot of discussion about that. I will say it's been my experience as the head of HR for many, many years that I do see a tremendous benefit in utilizing internal city employee raters when appropriate. Internal raters have greater familiarity with the various aspects of the organization, including departmental operations, budgetary policies, labor relations issues, personnel procedures, interdepartmental relationships, city-specific policies, procedures, codes, as well as a general understanding of the community itself and the community's needs. When we're utilizing internal raters on open recruitment processes, it's extremely common to do that. But when there is an in-house city employee candidate on an open recruitment process, even if it's just one, again, it's up to the human resources staff member assigned to that process to make sure that the individual that's selected for that panel doesn't have any potential conflicts with any candidates that might be internal. And again, the types of things we look at are, again, prior supervisory, professional, personal relationships, including even working in that same department. We try to avoid that completely and eliminate that up front. It gets a little more complicated when we're talking about promotional recruitment processes and the use of internal panelists on that. As the report does say on page 5, generally we try to avoid this. It's just the best practice overall to avoiding potential conflicts overall. But again, as I said earlier, internal raters can provide beneficial, helpful perspective in evaluating candidates, even on these promotional processes. The perspective of internal raters can be very helpful in assessing these candidates. Someone internally might have a good sense of the budgetary procedures, the knowledge, operational awareness, community awareness, things like that, which can be very helpful. And I will say, I'll use my own department as an example. Whenever I'm doing a recruitment for, say, a human resources analyst, whether it's an open recruitment or a promotional recruitment, I will always utilize somebody from within the organization, supplemented by people from other agencies, to be there, because the individuals that my departments serve are largely internal city departments, and when I am looking for somebody to be a solid, efficient HR analyst with good customer service skills, with good competencies in all the areas, I'm gonna want them to be able to to convey that to somebody within the organization. So it's not uncommon for me, again, to have maybe a battalion chief or a deputy department head or somebody that we serve sit on that panel, again, whether it's an open recruitment or a promotional recruitment. And we have the same thing in other departments. You may be looking, a department may be looking to hire a budget officer and somebody to do their budget or their financial matters. And you may want to have somebody from the finance department sitting there who would have some knowledge. If we do this, again, it's the obligation, responsibility of my staff to make sure that that there aren't any conflicts, and that whoever is selected to do that is far enough away from the candidate that's the candidates that are internal within the organization, to where there's no plausible problem with or conflict. And again, the conflict of interest form that I referenced earlier in this presentation is very helpful and beneficial in that. But ideally, we would sort these things out well in advance, and just not select somebody who we think might have any potential conflicts. Moving on, I was asked to address the recusal process. That is, if a decision is made to have a rater step out from a specific interview due to some perceived or potential conflict. As I've said, it's a safeguard that's employed to guard against potential conflicts of interest. And all that occurs is simply that rater steps out of the room and does not participate in either the interview or any follow-up discussion about that particular candidate. And once that interview is done, that rater comes back in and is advised not to discuss anything about that particular candidate with the others, to taint or potentially, and it could go both ways. It could be they like the candidate, or it could be somebody that they had a bad experience with. But either way, it is not their place to comment on a candidate if they're asked to step out. It doesn't happen that often, but when it does, they step out. The remaining raters would do the evaluations, do the scoring, and life would go on. In this report, I also wanted to talk about promotability panels. If you're following along, I'm on approximately page 6. Promotability panels are actually referenced in the civil service rules. They're used somewhat sparingly, and I was talking with the police chief. We were trying to think of anything other than police sergeant exams that we've ever even used these for. But I think he recalls that we might have used it for a police lieutenant exam in the past. But for the most part, it's a it's an exercise that has been used traditionally in this organization on the police sergeant process, and it typically will have 2 sworn managers, 2 sworn non-managers, and one. I'm sorry. 2 sworn managers, 2 sworn non-managers, and 1 non-sworn manager from the Glendale Police Department. Typically, they're all people from within the police department. And really, the focus of this is on the candidates' actual accomplishments, the tasks, the responsibilities for which they have volunteered, the projects they've completed, and when we do these, we will provide that interview panel with the last 3 performance evaluations. And really, it's designed to address really the performance and accomplishments of that candidate. It's really an effort to sort of key in on what that person has accomplished for this organization. The reason this is something that has been used is that the idea is that we certainly have more traditional forms of interviews, and this promotability panel would be used in conjunction with other interviews. But oftentimes, when you have an outside panel or even a non-technical internal panel, candidates can come in and give a really, really exceptional performance, so to speak, and they can discuss things that they've done, and it's very easy to embellish the record. And the promotability panel really, to put it crudely, it's sort of designed to avoid the BS factor and to make sure that every candidate is called upon, and as far as sorting out actual accomplishments throughout their career. Moving on with the report, I want to address just in general what we would call internal panels. And I hope this isn't confusing, but if you're following along in the report, internal panels are also referenced in our civil service rules, and they're often used for both promotional and open recruitment processes. And they're typically utilized in our public safety promotional processes, sometimes in combination with a community panel, as occurred in the most recent police lieutenant exam. And we almost always utilize these for our executive recruitments, where we have a professional panel, an internal panel, and a community panel. But again, the use of internal panels for this purpose really to be able to focus on the individual's managerial style, their temperament, their interpersonal skills, their teamwork orientation, things like self-awareness, their organizational awareness, and really essentially designed to assess whether the candidates have done their homework before on this organization. They're able to be called on that by people from within the organization. So again, this is something that we've utilized over time, again, in managerial positions, and like I said, almost exclusively on every executive recruitment that we've done. When it comes to some of these areas that I mentioned, these are areas that can be a bit more subjective, but if we tailor the questions properly, an internal panel can generally elicit some very helpful and effective responses. As with the other oral interview processes addressed in this report, again, when an in-house candidate is subject to an internal panel, the same safeguards are employed to ensure objectivity and the reduction of potential conflicts of interest. So, just to wrap up this report, and I'm going to conclude this with a section titled Ongoing Challenges, and I wasn't even sure whether to address this in the report, but from a practical standpoint, I almost have to. And this is just to say that it is a real challenge putting these selection processes together, particularly putting together interview panels. It's not like we have people waiting at our beck and call, ready to drop everything and spend their entire day here at the City of Glendale helping us with an interview panel. And yes, we do provide a free lunch, but that's not always the big attraction for folks. I just need to say it is extremely hard and becoming even more challenging to assemble these panels because whether it's people from within the organization or people from other organizations, really hard to get people to commit to a day or multiple days to do this. And in spite of our best efforts to plan these things well in advance, we do find ourselves on many occasions a day or so prior to the scheduled interview where we have 12 people coming in, and it's like, oh my gosh, we're still short of raters. And I will say, we are really, really hesitant to have to cancel that process and call all those people and say, sorry, even though you arranged to be off work to be here for this interview, we're going to have to postpone this process because we don't have enough interview panelists. So very often we're put in the position of looking internally and finding individuals that might be able to step in and complete an assembled panel in order for us to avoid having to cancel or postpone a process. And really what it'll do is delay that process probably 4 weeks to a month or so before we can get everything set up and scheduled, rescheduled. And in that time period, number one, the operating department that's trying to fill the position is ill-served, and we run the risk of losing candidates if we don't jump on these things and schedule them as efficiently as possible. So anyway, I do want to say again, while it has been recommended by some that we have some sort of blanket prohibition on utilizing internal raters on promotional recruitment processes, I just want to say from the standpoint of myself, staff, that would be a major problem for the organization, and as I said previously, cause some delays and really detract from our customer service abilities. And I grant you it's more important to do something right than to do it efficiently and slipshod. But again, we have to look at the practical aspects of this and making sure that again, if we were limited on what our options were for any aspect of these recruitment processes, it would really harm our efforts to provide good customer service to the organization. So with that, I thank you for your patience, and I thank you for allowing me to present this. I assume we'll have plenty of questions and dialogue, and be happy to answer your questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle, and I've observed that my fellow commissioners have annotated your briefing across all the pages, so I will begin on my right.
Start on the other
Should
side.
we impose a 5-minute period for questioning for each of us?
I have no questions.
I'll take his 5 and add 5 to that.
I knew that was going to be Mr. Gazarian's position.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Doyle, I direct your attention to page 38 of our package, which would be, I guess, page 1 of this item. So I'm looking at Rule 4, Section 10, A1, and then underneath that I have A1, A, B, C, D. For starters, B and C seem to be the same thought process, so I don't know if that's directly taken from the rules or not, but B and C seems to be just one continuum of a pitch, if you will, that oral board panelists shall complete a conflict of interest questionnaire prior to the administration of, and then it becomes C all of a sudden, continuing the sentence, the exam, to ensure that neither bias, the appearance of bias, nor conflict exists. My entire reading and review of this item, both prior to being here this evening and then following you while you presented it in great detail, is focused on this notion of conflict of interest and the understanding that mechanisms has been put in place to avoid a conflict of interest. So with that in mind, every comment I'm about to make, I want you to keep in mind that The last page of that, which is page 46 in our item, in our entire packet, has a conflict of interest questionnaire, which I'll say from the start that I find it to be deficient. I find it to be woefully deficient if this is our idea of ensuring that he or she who fills this conflict of interest questionnaire will have provided us with sufficient information for us to be satisfied that that person is free of conflict of interest. I would propose, after I point some of these points, some of these sections, I'm only going to propose an addition of one additional factor that I think would make it sufficient. Before I get there, so I looked at this whole thing, I see that in, for example, the Raider briefing and orientation. That's page 3 of your of your item on this. It talks about the questionnaire is asked if the Raider was contacted by or had any communication with anyone in the city of Glendale regarding the candidates being interviewed. Okay, I'd like to keep that in mind and then go into the next paragraph. It says in the middle of the paragraph, candidates then have the opportunity to discuss any potential conflicts involving the Raiders with the HR staff prior to their interview. And I'm imagining this to be taking place right before the interview occurs. Based on your explanation, I'm a candidate, I walk in, I see individuals, I go, oh boy, this person doesn't like me. So what? I'll pull Matt aside and go, Matt, she can't be sitting in on this. She hates me, or she's had an issue with me. So you then, as HR staff, will make a determination whether or not he or she gets to remain. Is my concern viable, well-founded, not well-founded? And then we go forward.
Right.
It seems to me that we're asking for trouble. There has to be a better way before that 11th hour, especially since I hear you say that we are at a disadvantage or at a loss in terms of recruiting people to be Raiders, and oftentimes we struggle to fill the slots. So that is a concern of mine. It's a concern of mine. I don't have an answer. Then it says, following discussion of potential conflicts. I'm curious as to what that means. You know, discussion of the potential conflicts with who? I mean, I would assume that if I come to you and I say I have a conflict, do you then go to the person with whom I am claiming to have a conflict and ascertain? And if you do, and then determine that, no, there is no conflict, that person is now tainted to begin with. Because that person, if you determine that there is no conflict and the person remains, do you not think that that person, human condition being human condition, is likely, or at least has the appearance of, now that person has heard the bell ring, we cannot unring the bell, and that person is going to sit and rate someone who he believes that someone thinks there's a problem between them, even if there wasn't. So that's another layer that causes me a concern. And I'll take you over to page 5, promotional recruitment processes. And of course, above that, the open recruitment processes. It seems like every section has the conflict of interest questionnaire is utilized to ascertain potential conflicts. The same applies for the promotional recruitment processes. And there, it says, this process allows both the interview panelists and candidates the ability to have the Raiders recused from the process if a potential conflict is apparent. So I invite you to elaborate, if you can, or if you may, how does one then recuse himself or herself? Is that person invited to recuse? What if they refuse to recuse? Is there some commitment by virtue of which, if the person, forgive me, I think of myself going to a court and I tell the judge, your husband is a DEA agent who was part of the raid on my client's warehouse, recuse yourself, and you know what, this is a real story. The judge tells me, no, I think I can be fair and impartial, I'm not going to recuse myself. what do you, I mean, I have mechanisms there as the party, but I don't know if a candidate has a mechanism. So how does that work? It's something for you to perhaps elaborate if you can.
I think at this particular point, Mr. Gazarian, and we did indicate, I am quite serious about maintaining, you have about 5 more minutes.
I appreciate that. I will be within that
If you want to conduct your cross-examination,
And by
that's
the
fine.
way, and by the way, you
No, no,
said
no.
sorry. You said questions. You never said anything about comments. So
That's
I
all
have
I
I have a lot of comments.
Oh,
but-
I
yeah.
will defer
Yeah,
back
no
to
problem.
you.
When you guys are
Comments,
done-
questions, regardless. This is
Chair,
each
may-
commissioner's
may-
opportunity.
it may be heard if you don't mind. I know.
Not to
is it
commence
okay?
comments or questions. Is
No,
this
no.
procedural?
Yeah.
All right, procedural, we will entertain.
If you don't mind. I know that time is long, and I know we've had 15-minute Civil Service Commission meetings, so we have some credit that we give back to the city on those 10, 15-minute credits. So my recommendation would be, this is a extremely, I can't say one more extremely, an important issue. I suggest that we don't limit. I know it might be a long.
Well, I'm
night.
willing to take a recommendation as
you
to
don't
time
mind-
for questioning. 15?
I think that we should do 15 to 20, as long as Mr. Gazarian, you, or anyone else in the panel needs to clarify their information that we need to get. I know it might run a little bit longer, but I think it's better for us to have the information than to wonder what the information might be if we don't ask the question. So my recommendation would be just to allow the commissioners to ask questions for a reasonable period of time.
All right.
If you don't mind.
I acknowledge that, Mr. Akarian. We've gleaned a tremendous amount of knowledge about procedure based upon things that are happening 2,700 miles away in terms of committee cross-examination and commentary. I do believe it's prerogative of the chair to impose a time restriction. I would say I would accept 15 minutes.
But I don't believe that time. We've never had a time limit put on the commissioners. The chair has a right to impose limits on the.
I'm just suggesting, look, I'm willing
Yeah,
to
I mean,
entertain
in
a motion.
12 years, I've
I
never
just-
seen that.
I just want to make this efficient. Do you want to set 20 minutes?
I won't even need more than 2 minutes. That's not the point.
Yeah, let's do 20. That's
20
I
minutes.
recommend 20 minutes.
And I would accept that recommendation.
If this was about me, I
Oh, it has nothing to
don't
do
plan
with
on
you.
being any more than a few
No, it
more
has
minutes.
nothing to do with you. It's just a
Okay.
process.
But I would
So I
like.
hear two for 20 minutes.
Yes.
Is there any objection to a 20-minute rule?
Again, we've never seen. This is not something that the chair doesn't. I mean,
Well, I think I do have that prerogative, and I can impose that time, but I would want to entertain the suggestions from members of my commission. Right now, I have 20 minutes. I think that that's certainly adequate for the purposes of examination. Why don't we proceed based upon that? We have one objection, but Mr. Gazarian, you
I
have...
have two objections.
Okay.
I think I'm on the same page with Commissioner Manukian. I don't think there should be any time limit. We're here to make sure the process is fair and on a level playing field, and if it takes 5 minutes, or it takes 20 minutes, or it takes 30 minutes for a commissioner to figure out for himself that this is what it's going to take to make it a fair process, I don't think there should be any limit on commissioners' time for discussion.
All right, let me look across the commissioners. Is that the consensus of the commissioners that we should have an unlimited period for examination?
Yes.
That's what I was. That's what I was.
And proceed.
basically trying to say.
All right, thank you. We were, I was bringing you along to page 5, and on page 5, you have again talked about the safeguards that exist, and you've gone to the recusal process, which is on the top of page 6. And you spoke about it both here and in your written form, that you give specific instructions for that person not to discuss it with the others. I'm satisfied with the instruction aspect. As I told you a moment ago, I'm a little concerned about how one goes about facing a recusal, if you will. On the internal panel, internal panels, this is what you seem to have put very well at the last sentence of the paragraph. Internal panels are almost always utilized for executive level selection processes in combination with professional and community panels, right? Okay, so then you also come in and you just said to me or to us that generally we try to avoid use of internal panels or raters. Am I correct in deducing that the internal panel may have an internal rater in there, right? So you said generally we try to avoid use of internal raters when the process is promotional, right? But so I'm a little bit in a conflict because at the top of page 7, your last sentence of that paragraph that began from page 6 is an internal panel provides a unique yet critical perspective to the hiring department from experienced managers and employees most well-versed in the needs and experiences of the organization. Yet you just told us that you try to avoid that, but they provide a great deal of, value. So I'm a bit confused, and in light of the fact that I know that there's another agenda item coming that discusses about all of these panels again. It would help me in landing at a place where I feel fair and equitable for all if I understood that better, and I don't. And you know, to your credit, as always, with your hard work, you say for executive level interview processes, very often the internal panel is the most challenging. So I'd like to know what those challenges are and how we can eliminate those challenges, especially since you've devoted an entire section on ongoing challenges thereafter, which is very transparent, and I appreciate the transparency. But you conclude that by saying, at the very end, you say, given the aforementioned safeguards that currently exist to avoid potential conflicts of interest, such a proposal would be unnecessary, et cetera, et cetera. So this is where I'm at, and thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Gazarian. Mr. Manukian?
Mr. Chair, could I respond to questions
certainly,
individually?
Certainly. If in fact they were framed as questions, and you would.
I mean, if you understood what I said, I tried to be quick.
You have 2 minutes.
But I have lifted any time restriction based upon the consensus of the commission.
Thank you.
I'd like to, Mr. Chair, respond to Commissioner Gazarian. There are 3 main items. The first being that he had some concerns over the conflict of interest form and some deficiencies. And if there are suggestions and recommendations to make that better, I'd be more than happy to.
With the chair's permission, I'll give you the one-liner later when you're done.
Okay. This form has been around a long time, and a few years back, I think the commission did provide some input on it, and I believe it was Commissioner Devine specifically, and we did beef it up quite significantly, and it's a better form today than it was originally. And if we can improve upon that model, I'd be more than happy to consider that as well. The second part was you had questions about how the recusal process occurs, and I want to make it clear the discussion between the HR staff and the raters is obviously separate from the discussion the HR staff member has with the candidates when they come in. And there's no interchange or dialogue where they would come in and say, hey, so-and-so wants you off. It's not done that way. It's done separately. If there's a panelist that has a concern, they'll raise it and we'll address it at that time. And it's up to the judgment of the HR staff member to make that determination. The action that occurs with the candidate, and I understand your point about somebody walking in for an interview and seeing, oh my gosh, look at the name here. If anyone has a better way of doing that, I'd be open to that. But short of sending these names out in advance prior to the interview, which wouldn't be a good idea because the candidates could do research and perhaps contact those individuals if they know who they are ahead of time, that I wouldn't recommend. But essentially, that interaction between the HR staff member and the candidate, again, is done separately. And this isn't a decision that those individuals are making. Those individuals will say, here's my concern. And then it's up to my staff member to say, okay, I'll make that. They make that determination. And sometimes they'll check with a supervisor. Sometimes they'll walk over into my office and say, here's what we got. And that's done separately. So it's not like a rater is going to have the choice where I come in and say, well, so-and-so thinks, you may have a conflict. What do you think? It doesn't work that way. The decision is made. And again, that's why my staff, exists to oversee these things, is to make those decisions. And, it doesn't become a choice or an option. And if we ever had a rater who said, well, doggone it, I'm not stepping out for this one, then we would have that rater excused, and they could go back to the city of Burbank or wherever they came from. Kidding. So that's more or less how that works. And again, your third point having to do with seemingly perhaps there may be a mixed message I'm sending. I will say we do lots of these interview panels almost every day of the week, and the majority of them, there are no problems whatsoever, and we have no issues at all typically when we're doing an open recruitment and all the candidates are from outside the organization. It's rare that we have any type of conflict. But, and so with open recruitments, it's not a big issue. When we do a promotional, that's when, and that's when I said in the report, I think to quote me, it is generally avoided. But I hope I'm not sending mixed messages when I will say that under the right circumstances and under, certainly for positions of a managerial level, that we do feel, and I think we have, more or less a good track record of enabling internal raters to sit on promotional interview processes, assuming there's no direct conflict. And again, that's what my staff gets paid to do. That's why they make the big bucks. Right, guys? It's their job to make sure that these are fair and objective processes. And, if there's any hint of a potential conflict, I can tell you in most cases that HR analyst is not going to even select that person in the first place. And they may say, you know what, so-and-so from Public Works would be great for this interview panel. And they may bounce it off of, myself or Ms. Hunanian. And they'll say, well, wait a minute, but remember 15 years ago, that candidate used to work for this candidate and used to do his evaluation and say, oh, yeah, that's right. I mean, these are things we try to sort out in advance so we don't end up with these awkward situations. And, that's more or less my pitch is that I think, it's not a perfect system. And, but I think, if we employ the safeguards correctly, number one, not selecting people who have any conflicts to begin with, and then number two, utilizing the conflict of interest form, I think we can avoid most major problems.
With the chair's permission, I'd like to suggest to you the additional factor that you might want to consider. You have 5 factors that you have set forth in the conflict of interest questionnaire. I view 1 and 2 to be rather benign because it just asks if they worked in the same organization. Well, clearly the internal panelists will have worked in the same organization. Number 2, have you supervised? Well, that gets a little warmer. We know that person has had a supervisory relationship with the candidate. Number 3 and 4 are more substantive. Have you been contacted or had any communications with anyone in the city of Glendale regarding the candidate that you're going to be interviewing? That's good. 4 is good. Have you been involved socially, professionally, or financially? That's very good, especially if you're involved financially. 5, are you now or have you been in the past related to any candidate? Yes, useful. And here's a 6th one for you to consider, Mr. Doyle. Have you been a witness or a party to any dispute, claim, or a complaint, or administrative or legal action involving any of the candidates. Because without going into knowledge that I've accumulated over the last 8 years serving on this commission, that's shorter than Commissioner Abkarian and Commissioner Devine, and I don't know the rest, but I know that, just like there's disagreements at home with family members, there's disagreements at a place of employment. And the last thing we would want is those who have had disagreements and have not come to hug and kiss and make up be sitting in judgment of one another. That's my recommendation. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Gazarian, I think that's an excellent suggestion, and we'd be happy to employ that
I'm going to ask the recorder if he could and his staff to note those recommendations, and as we pursue perhaps a further review of this subject at a later meeting, it might be that Commissioner Gazarian or another of my fellow commissioners will frame that in terms of a motion, a directive of sorts. And so I just want to keep a running tabulation and identification and listing of those recommendations that come from my fellow commissioners, and they can be reported back to us in the minutes. Would that be acceptable?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Manukian?
Yes, thank you. My, just going to be short comments. By the way, I love that recommendation. That's a good addition. I think, in my opinion, first of all, it's important to have internal raters because, in my opinion, no one knows the department and what is required to be in that department. I can sit here and try to pretend that I think I can understand what that. No, at the end of the day, the next, for example, the next item that's coming up. In my opinion, that the members of the department are perfect candidate to be able to assess someone's ability to be a part of that department. I understand there will always be issues of conflict, and I think from what I am seeing, I feel comfortable at least that there are safeguards in place. And also, and one question I had, for all these years that you've been doing this, for us just to get an idea, how many times have you had situations that the applicant has requested the individual to an individual to be recused? Is just off the top of your head? Is this a common occurrence, or is this something that?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Manukian, it is a very infrequent situation. Like I said, probably 95% of the time, those types of potential conflicts are addressed by simply not selecting certain individuals to be on a panel. It's when someone is selected and it's sort of a, oops, I didn't realize this person used to work in that agency, 5 years ago, and that applies whether it's promotional open or whether we have internal raters or external raters. So I'm looking at staff and.
No, I think you answered the question. So it's not a.
It isn't very common occurrence.
And do you recall situations that someone has requested? For example, if Garo's rating me, I want this guy removed from there. Have you had a lot of situations where you said no, he needs to stay? If somebody's requested a rater to be recused?
Commissioner Manukian, we would exercise the most abundance of caution in that case and have the recusal occur.
It would be rare. If I understand correctly, it would be rare for you to say no, this individual has to stay.
Yeah.
For example. Okay.
That wouldn't happen.
Yeah, and again, basically, in my opinion, the department head should have some flexibility to be able to pick the members of its team according to their qualifications. And as much as I believe that our input is important, but also we have to have some ability for individuals to be on that panel to be able to understand what truly the work involved. And that's basically it. Oh my.
Anything further, Mr. Menuchyan,
No,
at this
no,
time?
no.
Thank you. And I believe, Mr. Abkarian, you will begin your questioning and commentary.
Sure. I just have, I think most of the comments that I had, Mr. Kazarian has already addressed. So I'm only have two items that I'll discuss then after that. And the first, before I get to those, my understanding was this item was agendized, so any motion, we can actually bring a motion today to vote
Good.
on. Is it my understanding that we can actually bring a motion to vote on any changes to these rules?
Mhm.
So that could be done today. That's what my understanding is. One thing that I read here that your conflict of interest questionnaire says prevent any misunderstandings, complaints, and even a perception of favoritism. Perception is sometimes very, very difficult. So when I read in here that sometimes representative from the operating department will join the Raider and HR staff for lunch, however, no discussion of examination process specific candidate takes place at the time, the fact that they're having lunch together is a problem for me already. Because if a candidate is out there and is walking by and sees that the Raider, the department representative, and the HR having lunch together, regardless of what the discussion is during that lunch, that would be a problem on a perception by the department head.
Absolutely.
So my recommendation, and we will have a motion at some point, that there's no way that a Raider and the department head could have lunch together or have any communication after that person from the department leaves that day. They can't have lunch together. If somebody's walking by, seeing them having lunch together, I don't care if they're talking about football. They're going to think that they're talking about something to do with the candidates for interviews that day, and there will be a perception of impropriety.
You're talking about that day, right?
That day.
Yeah,
Talking about that day. It says sometimes representatives from the operating department will join the Raider and the HR staff for lunch, however, no discussion. So my recommendation would be never to have the Raider and the department person have lunch together on a day that they're actually doing a rating of all the employees.
Mr.
It's
Abkarian,
just for
you want that-
perceptions.
You want that recorded?
That I would like to have as a motion later to discuss.
Please note that in that catalog of potential action items or motions.
The issues with the conflict of interest questionnaire, I think, was addressed, and we can also look into maybe even adding more. As Mr. Doyle said, he doesn't mind. And I don't have any issues that Mr. Doyle will do everything he can to avoid any conflicts. I do have one issue with the actual rating sheet itself. The overall likelihood of success. I have a major problem with that one line item making a decision as to somebody being able to go into something or not go into something. I'm assuming that 1 through 6 will give you what you need without number 7 being there. But to say that all of a sudden somebody might get all 3s, and on number 7, if majority say no, we're going to give it a 2, then they're going to fail everything, is a bit of a concern to me. Because my understanding would be that if that person is not qualified, they're going to get some 2s along the way from 1 to 6. And if they do, then they're not going to get the 70%. Even if they get 1, 2, my understanding would be that they won't qualify. Correct? If they get all 3s and 1, 2, then they're not going to get the 70%.
Correct, but if they get all 6s and 1, 2, they would probably pass.
They will pass. Now, this is my problem, that if that's the case, then all 6s and 1, 2, then you come in at the end and you say, well, a majority of us are going to give, especially on the internal panel on promotability, you're going to say, well, we think that we're going to give this person a 2. If 3 out of 5 say it's a 2, then regardless of what the numbers are on all the other stuff, that person is going to fail automatically.
And that's the one.
That one line could fail someone regardless of what they've gotten on the 1 through 6, correct?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. I want to also put a motion in to actually eliminate number 7 from the actual rating. Because if there is an issue, 1 through 6 should address that issue. And there shouldn't be a number 7 to address a catch-all kind of an issue. So if there is an issue, preparation and experience, communication skill, technical knowledge, somewhere along the line, people are going to get 2s and got to get lower numbers. And there doesn't need to be catch-all on number 7 that would basically catch everything.
That's the overall likelihood of
Yes.
success?
I'll second that. If you're making a motion.
May I respond, Mr. Chair?
I think that there should be conversation. Yes, we have a proposal at some point tonight, as we're devoting attention to this particular process. We're going to, again, review what our recommendations. We will then ask the particular proponent to frame it in terms of a motion to see if we can get a second, and then we will have further conversation. But, Mr. Recorder, yes, you're certainly in the discourse and in the examination between Mr. Abkarian and yourself, you have a right to respond.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I'll try to address the issues that each commissioner raises. And I see there are 2 from Commissioner Abkarian. The issue of lunches, we're not trying to shield the the raters from the departments blanket in a blanket fashion. We're trying to avoid even the temptation or some potential for them to say something to try to taint the process, and I think that's an appropriate concern. But the lunch is, and it doesn't happen all the time, but it is often a means of that department, expressing appreciation for those individuals coming to help us for an entire day. And again, I trust my staff to make sure that they're not making any inappropriate gestures or conversations relating to scoring and things of that nature. And I mean, we've had situations, for example, when we do our executive recruitments, we'll have city managers from other agencies come in and sit on a professional panel, city managers and department heads, and do I tell Ms. Beers, I'm sorry, you can't come in and join us for lunch? No.
For her, no lunch for a week.
We have Ms. Beers, her staff, and those individuals will join us, and typically in those cases we'll bring lunch in, and so I just I don't want there to be any impression that there's anything nefarious going on if a department head or a supervisor happens to join us for lunch. And again, I would ask that the commission trust their staff to make sure that we safeguard those types of things. And so, I mean, that may be a minor point, but I think it bears some saying. The issue relating to the overall likelihood of success dimension, Commissioner Abkarian, I completely understand your concerns about, that person can do really well, but they can just be failed on that one rating. And again, I don't want to minimize any of that. I will say the scenario that you raise is not one that would happen very frequently, where somebody does really well, but and all the different areas, yet they do poorly and get failed in that one rating point. The reason that dimension exists on the rating sheet is to address those candidates who exhibit some type of a fatal flaw in the process. And I hate to get crude or give really bad examples, but someone who might come in and make an inappropriate comment, a racial slur or something along those lines, or a candidate that just gives an answer that's so unusual, they might be a great interviewer. And that's the thing. We have some people who are really outstanding interviewers. They come in and give a great, for lack of a better term, performance. Yet there may be some other aspects that are maybe a little more difficult to define that make that would question their ability to really do the job and be an effective hire. And ultimately, if we can't fail someone who comes in and exercises really poor judgment in this process, they're going to end up on the list. And when we send those 3 names to the appointing authority to make that decision, I may have a department said and said, hey, based on what that person said, I'm never going to hire them. But sorry, you're stuck with them. So, pick one of the other 2. But that's more or less what I would have to say, Commissioner Abkarian, and I hope you understand that. And it's not my intent here to push back on any input or suggestions, but rather to clarify what we've been doing and how this has worked, for many years. So.
Okay.
Mr. Abkarian?
Just a quick comment. In reference to as I said, I don't want to prevent you from having lunches, but everything that I read in this particular documentation talks about perception of impropriety, perception of bias. And if I'm a candidate, I'm passing by and I'm seeing that the rater and the department head are having lunch together, laughing, smiling, doing whatever they do, the perception automatically is something is off. If I'm passing by and I see it and I'm a candidate, I promise you that I'm going to say, there's something going on in here. I better be careful because they're very, very close and there's something going on here. This is on the external or the internal panel. So I say on that one lunch, out of every other lunch that you have, just to avoid the perception, I will keep it completely separate. That would be my recommendation.
And would you like that recommendation noted?
I already
Thank
mentioned
you.
it, and we'll discuss it. The second thing is, in reference to what you said, if somebody actually have a racial slur or something else, communication skills, interpersonal skills, and decision making and judgment, I would give him a 0. If I can give him a 0, I'll give him a 1 without a doubt. And I would, on the rater comment, I would make a comment about the racial slur. So anything that you have, I'm not saying don't give them a lower number. I'm just saying any lower number you want to give, it's already been decided in the 6th item already on top. So there doesn't need to be anything else. Communication skill, you would give them as 1, and in the bottom you say there was a racial slur, and I think that there's a problem. In fact, it says continue to the back, and I would continue to the back and write the rest. So that's the reason that I don't believe there needs to be a catch-all by number 7. That would be just my comment.
Thank you, Mr. Gazoon. Mr. Abkarian, just for the record, Mr. Recorder, this document that we've addressed for the last couple of minutes, this interview sheet, is this across-the-board document? Is this a template that is used in all the interviews, or are there variations of this document? Because there is a proposed motion which our deputy recorder has annotated, and we're going to be voting on the contents of this document. Is this document used across the board?
Are you referring to attachment 3? Or
Absolutely.
3?
One that
some
Mr.
variation
has addressed.
Mr. Chair, some variation of that, but obviously, depending on the position, the dimensions are different.
Dimensions, could you explain that? The dimensions meaning the questions or the framework or just the margins?
But the Roman numeral items are the specific job-related dimensions for that particular job. And depending on the position, like I said, it could be civil engineer, it could be electrical line mechanic, or it could be assistant library director. We're going to have different rating dimensions on that. But the one thing that is consistent, yes, would be that final dimension is always the overall likelihood of success. And it's been in effect for, longer than I've been in this organization.
The reason we ask is if, in fact, there is a motion and that motion is seconded and voted upon, then that will be a direction to your office to make changes or corrections to the process by which this document is employed to include other issues.
I do want to say, and again, I'm not intending for this to go back and forth, but there is a reference to the overall likelihood of success dimension in the rules. So any motion to eliminate that would, I suppose, require an amendment of the rules, which has to go before the commission.
The rule says that there's an overall likelihood of success
Yes.
notation in the rating.
We can address that, if I may, Mr. Chair, members of the commission.
Mhm.
There is a rule, Rule 5, Section 2, subsection C3, that talks about that particular.
Could you read that, please?
Yes. So what that, under requisition certification and employment, and there may be other places where that particular item is highlighted, but we were able to identify it here readily. It says certification tie-breaking procedures when 2 or more candidates have achieved the same final score. Preference on a certification from an eligible list shall be established by the following order, and number 3 states attainment of highest score in the overall likelihood of success dimension in the applicable exam component. So that's the one place that where it appears currently. It's used as a tie-breaking mechanism. But from a procedural perspective, what we would be able to do certainly is, for example, the first proposed amendment that was made by Mr. Gazarian with regard to the adjustment of the form, that wouldn't require rule amendment, so we would be able to have the commission review that and make that as a suggestion. So those that the commission agrees to today, we can certainly implement those immediately, but those that require rule amendments would require the normal process of going through a rule amendment. And so we think this would be one of those, the elimination from the oral interview rating sheet of item number 7.
Thank you.
It doesn't suggest that we don't continue to discuss it and perhaps bring it back in some fashion.
And that, you've sort of illustrated the issue of timing in terms of recommendations that become possible motions, because, for instance, you're making reference to the rules, which might require ultimately on a rule change to have the council come forward and approve any such rule change. That said, have we identified each one of the recommendations from my fellow commissioners thus far?
Yes.
Because that's going to be the most critical thing, at least procedurally. We have to know where we must go. With that, I believe, Mr. Abkarian, have you concluded your questioning and commentary?
I am.
Mr. Devine.
Okay, well, fortunately, my colleagues have covered most everything that I was going to talk about. I do have a couple of quick questions on the conflict of interest questionnaire. If a potential interviewer checks yes to any of these 5, and now hopefully we'll have the 6th item on there, if they check yes to any of those, does that automatically disqualify them from being an interviewer?
No, Commissioner Devine, and let me get the form so I can reference that. But for example, if someone checks yes to number 1, have you worked in the same organization as any candidate for this examination? That would not be an automatic disqualifier. If I used to work in the Los Angeles County that has 50,000 employees and someone else, that wouldn't constitute a conflict necessarily. Just depends on the contact, the scope, the size of that organization.
So if someone checks yes on that, what's the next step?
There would be some follow-up inquiry by the members of staff. So what do you mean? What employer did you both work for? What capacity? Did you interact? That sort of thing.
If someone checks number 4, yes, that they've been involved, say, professionally with any candidate, would that automatically disqualify them?
Now, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Devine, that would be a difficult one to answer. I would say in most cases probably yes, but it just depends, socially, professionally, financially. I mean, certainly financially would be a concern. Socially, professionally, I could be a member of a professional organization, affiliated with, the fire profession or the engineering profession or something like that. And, that may be an organization that has, 500 members.
So it flags it for you guys to go further in.
Exactly. It flags it, and it enables us to make further inquiry.
You have, forgive me, Chair and Commissioner Devine, you have a yes. So you have a section that says if the answer is yes to any of them, you have several lines there.
Yes.
After number 5. It seems to me that none of these are disqualifiers, but they are flags for you to go inquire further.
That's correct.
That's what it looks
Mr.
like.
Devine, you are incorporating that question from Mr. Gazarian. I saw the interplay between the two of you, but please continue.
Okay, so I guess the bottom line then on this whole conflict of interest questionnaire is that at the end of the day, it's your staff that's going to determine whether or not a candidate, a interviewer is disqualified. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's why we exist.
And then if the,
So that's what you do.
I've been
so
asked.
then if a candidate happens to disagree or feels that there's a conflict, even though you've determined there wasn't, then the recusal process comes into play. Is that correct?
Commissioner Devine, I don't know if the candidate is being asked if there's a conflict. The candidate is being asked to respond to a series of questions.
No, I'm talking about.
Oh, sorry.
I'm calling these interviewers. If the interviewers check yes and you vet them and you see there's no problem, then the next safeguard for the candidate who's taking the exam, being interviewed by one of these interviewers, his only recourse then is to follow the recusal process. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And I do want to add again, this does not happen often. I mean, we're spending a lot of time here talking about this, but this is a general rarity.
Well, the thing that I think is key for me, and Commissioner Abkarian really brought this to light when he said it, when he's talking about the perception, dealing with the lunches, but to me, the perception also follows through the whole process here. And you mentioned in many places that you first stated that the internal panels really aren't the best thing, that you try to avoid them if possible. Then you went into the challenges and what would happen if you didn't have the ability to bring in the internal panels. But what I got out of all of that was that this whole problem dealing with the internal panels and the triggering possibly of the candidate having to recuse a panelist, that all stems around, from what I gather, problems with the organization, with the HR department, and trying to put together an exam in a timely manner. And for me, it does not address the real problem, which the Civil Service Commission, or at least this commissioner, is concerned about, and that's the problem with the candidate who's taking the exam. And by having this internal panel and setting up all these safeguards and whatnot, I feel that the problem is really for the candidate, and that he's faced with now the perception, if he disqualifies a interview or something, that there's something wrong. So my goal would be to see, and I don't know if my colleagues would agree, to see if the problem with the organization can be solved in some other way than putting in this internal panel.
And I was always trying to frame that in terms of an action item, or is that one that you're soliciting further study?
That's just a
and
comment.
further?
That's my feeling. I'm not suggesting that we do that. I'm just saying that that's my take on this process, that the problem is being emphasized for the organization, but it's not being considered as to the impact on the candidate because of the internal panel. And that's just a general comment, and where I'm coming from on this at this point.
Are you suggesting, Mr. Devine, any recommendations that could indeed materialize into motions at this point? Not putting the pressure on you
No.
at all, but your comments are quite apropos, and within those comments are certain very strong suggestions.
Well, following up on that, then, and I agree. The only thing I could think of, short of, making a motion to do away with internal panels, and again, when we use the word internal panel, that to me is also kind of nebulous, because there are different levels of interviewers that will be on an internal panel. It could be an executive, could be, as you've said, in the next case we're going to be looking at, was it the assistant executive or whatever?
And sworn versus non-sworn. I think in one setting.
Well, we say the executives, upper management employees, as well as employee association representatives. So I think that in looking at the internal panels, we need to see the impact of those three those three types of interviewers: the executives, the assistant directors, and then the association. And I know on the one that we're going to be considering next, there's never been a exam for a captain where we've included anything other than executives on the internal panel. So,
I'm sorry, Commissioner, is this another item?
Well, no, I'm just saying that
He is making commentary, and he is addressing inferentially the next agenda item. But what I am certainly looking to Mr. Devine for are those recommendations which we might act upon at some certain point, whether today or later.
I would then make a recommendation that staff come back with a report indicating how the problem for the organization can be solved with other than an internal panel that uses less than executive level personnel on the internal panel, or other than executive, I won't say less than, other than executive members of the internal panel, to come back with a report which would indicate what can be done to create an internal panel.
That it's only management and executive.
Management and executive positions.
And that's been duly noted at the conclusion of our examination and commentary, and any further round, if any commissioners want to re-examine, we'll then put those forward as items and incorporate any directive from a commissioner that such an item become a motion.
Mr. Chair, I see that the city manager wanted to kind of make a comment. I'm not sure if this is the right time for it or not.
No,
I think we should.
I think at this point, if you could hold for just a second, because the moment that we go into motion, we will indeed invite you up, if we could. We just want to put.
But I'd like to hear what she has to say.
Oh, no, definitely. It's just a matter of timing.
Before we.
Oh, absolutely. The view of it, Mr. Manukian, is, and that's why I was so careful that these recommendations that were made by my colleagues.
But we might
were
have
in fact,
recommendations after she speaks.
That's exactly right, but that means that recommendations are either recommendations or they're action items, meaning motions. So we're going to have the recommendations read back. For those recommendations that should be, and if I get a motion from any of us, then that becomes an action item. If I get a second, or a motion and a second, and then at that point we have further conversation and we divide up the expertise of the city manager, and of course look to Mr. Doyle for further commentary. Right now this is just discussion.
Yeah, no, I know, but at least speaking for myself, before I respond to anyone's motion, I'd like to hear what our city manager has.
Oh, I'm not in any way precluding the city manager. You see, such expertise is absolutely essential for the determination. I'm just trying to put some structure on here.
I understand.
So we have the, Mr. Devine, do you have any further commentary or examination? I will again.
Mr. Chair, we'd like some clarification on Commissioner Devine's suggestion. Is it is he recommending that internal panels be made up with only executives or management level personnel?
This is my understanding, is that Mr. Devine said to bring back a report as to what could be done. I don't think there's a motion to do it today. I think
No.
it's a report to be brought back for us to see if we can do an internal panel with just management and executives in the internal panel.
Mr. Devine?
That's correct.
report.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's
that
the-
still can be, it will be framed as a motion. It'll be, we'll vote upon it. We ask that the
We just needed the
staff
clarification
come
from the
back.
staff's
Thank you.
perspective.
Staff will come back with a report.
Thank you.
All right. We again look to the commissioners for any further commentary, and seeing none.
I'd like to hear from the city manager.
I'd like to hear from our chair first.
I think at this point, I think the chair should maintain some semblance of neutrality. So with that.
We're all neutral.
Absolutely. So at that, I would ask our deputy recorder to come forth. We'll go one each item. If you'll read the item, and then I'll look to my commissioners and ascertain if there's any one of my commissioners who's going to make that a motion.
Mr. Chair, do you mind if I make a comment?
Certainly, sir.
Because I see the concern on Mr. Manukian's face, and I understand what he's saying. He's saying that I might second or not second, depending on what the city manager says.
All right.
And because of that, I
You know
think
what?
that hearing...
With that liberality and with a suggestion to be as inclusive as possible, then we will invite the city manager. Thank you, and please understand it's just a matter of timing, but
Absolutely.
please go ahead, and commentary is invited.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the commission. I'm not sure if I remember what I was going to share with you all, but I will do my best.
That's why you get paid the big bucks.
That's absolutely true, and I've been part of this organization, as you all know, for a very long time. I don't want to say that I'm, old and been here long, but a long-standing member of this organization, and have participated in a number of internal panels within this organization, and participated in a number of external panels outside of the organization when other cities have invited me and or asked me to provide names of staff members to go to other jurisdictions to provide that assistance, which, as Mr. Doyle initially indicated, it's something that we try to do with other municipalities so that we are helpful to one another, because panels occur weekly, and cities across California, and in particular those in our neighborhoods, need the assistance as much as we need their assistance, and our calendars don't always work out. Outside of that, and I think Mr. Doyle spent some time covering the importance of internal panels at times, outside of the scheduling piece, and I don't want to underemphasize the scheduling piece, but I don't want to underemphasize the importance of internal panels at times either. And by that internal panel, I don't mean an all internal panel all the time. There are times where I think internal panels are necessary. I will tell you, I've utilized them. I've hired 7 executives in 2 years, in less than 2 years. I've made a couple of direct appointments, but outside of that, I have utilized our civil service process to go through the processes of the panels that are set up. And me being the new city manager and providing input to the city council in terms of my style and maybe some of the experience we may have had in the past, and that would be in the recent past, within the police department. I let the city council know what my style is in terms of my process, and what I bring to the table, and I think it's one of transparency and has been, as it is within the Human Resources Department and all of the department heads. That's extremely important to all of us. I think you have professionals who work in this organization, and I would put them side by side, any other organization, and say, pound for pound, we are one of the best organizations around, and in particular our Human Resources Department, where they have had to, at times, come forward with difficult information. And I think some of you have experienced that in the past based on the fact that Mr. Doyle, as the chief examiner, has done that in the past and has that capacity to do so if something is not right. So kind of outlining a process maybe that is a little bit of read between the lines without describing exactly all the nuances that had occurred in the past. I don't want some of the that one experience possibly, and or the discomfort of maybe 1 or 2 individuals or maybe more within the organization who might feel uncomfortable being in front of internal panels. At the end of the day, we want to hire the best for the positions that we have in place, no matter what position they're filling, no matter where they are within the hierarchy of the organization. Making sure that we're fair, objective, the process is clean, is something that is paramount in terms of the work that we do. That perspective from the inside is something that an outside panelist cannot bring to the table. And I'm not saying any of you have said no internal panels whatsoever, but I'm just making a statement broadly that says that piece that is necessary is extremely important. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought in terms of the city council. And my conversation with the city council based on kind of what I would do as the new city manager, which hasn't been done in the past, is to include the city council for the executive level recruitments, whereby each of the council members give me a candidate from the community, a panelist, a rater from the community who could serve on that panel. It's a perspective, right? So it's a perspective from the community, whereas in the past it would be the city manager along with HR who would figure out maybe, who are the best individuals to be on that panel from the community. And it worked out just fine. There's nothing wrong with that process, but my style, and I think what we needed at the time, timing's, always important, and my guarantee to the council was that I would include them whenever possible, whether it's committees, whether it's panels for executive level positions. And that was not necessarily comfortable for my organization, to include the political frame within the administration of the organization, because there needs to be a separation. City council ultimately has 2 employees, myself and the city attorney. And so to allow that process to possibly permeate into the organization maybe made some people uncomfortable. But I trust my council members are going to give me names where folks are going to be, hopefully, bring a perspective to the table, but also be unbiased. And it's worked out just fine. At the end of the day, the cream of the crop will rise to the top. No matter what's being said behind the scenes, no matter who's trying to lobby for what behind the scenes, no matter what politics are happening behind the scenes, I truly believe at the end of the day, because our process is clean, because we have a system in place that has been in place for many, many years, I think it works out well. So it's about perspective in my mind. So council's perspective comes into play in processes that I'm a part of. And the internal panel, there's a perspective there to be had. It is an important perspective at times. At times it's to fill a seat because we are unable to get others from the outside. But as Mr. Doyle said, that is rare. We really try to get folks from the outside. But there are times where we want an internal individual or an internal panel to be in place for that perspective, to allow us that ability to understand that perspective from the inside. And I've had the associations on the panels as well for executive level positions. So it's executives and associations, unions that are there. And again, all of that's worked out well, and we've been able to move through that process. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of perspective. It wasn't to refute any of the items that any of you had brought forward. I think some of the suggestions are absolutely well taken by staff, and we will implement, such as the conflict of interest, and I have filled out many of these throughout the years, and I'm trying to remember if I've ever been asked to leave. I don't think so, but I think I've been part of a panel when someone themselves, the rater who saw the list, said, I'm going to recuse myself on this one because of X, Y, Z. I think it works. I think it works pretty well, and we haven't had any issues. But with that, I'd entertain any questions that you may have, and I appreciate the ability to speak, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Manoukian?
No, thank you.
I have just one question.
Yes, sir.
Ms. Beers. So as I understand it, you said that you're bringing in, I'm paraphrasing, a political component, council members nominating from the community members to sit on a community panel. And is it am I correct in understanding that that's already taken place in other executive level?
Since I've been city
engagement?
manager, yes.
Yeah, it has.
It
Okay.
has. Since the
So-
day I became city manager, 7 appointments, of which I believe we've had a process for 5. Excuse me, for 4. All 4 of those had community panels.
You know, I just to be on the record, I mean, I have no issues with the professional panel, none with the internal panel as a concept. I have some concerns about the community panel, and the reason that is that when I read that any candidate who fails one portion of the exam fails the exam. Yes, you know, with my utmost respect to elected officials sitting as city council members, you put community members to sit as a community panelists for a chief of police or for a captain exam, next item. I don't know those people's qualifications, and I kind of feel, you know, I don't want to say, well, city council cannot find the right person, but, you know, we're a city of 200,000 people. There's all sorts of characters in this city, and we are not all what we appear to be, are we? Yeah. So the fact that some 5 civilians who are going to come in and they're going to not like the person's attire or hair or lack of hair or who knows what, it kind of makes me uneasy that outsiders, it's one thing for a professional panel to fail. It's another thing, it's also the similar thing for an internal panel to fail someone. I would find bases for their decision. But a community panel, if I was a candidate, I would want to know, well, exactly what were their qualifications that they failed me.
I agree,
So that's my
100%,
comment.
by the way.
That's my comment.
If I can
Sure.
respond, and it's a perspective again from me, and that is truly my working relationship with the council is such that we're able to, with all 5 council members, have a conversation regarding their thoughts about who they're thinking about placing on the panel, and my thoughts about whether it's a good idea or not. And we have that relationship. I have that relationship with every council member where they'll say, I'm thinking of X individual from the community. And I have in the past said, have you thought about the ramifications of that possibly? And so we have that dialogue. And again, I know council members can change, city managers can change, et cetera. Processes may change through time. What I can say, though, is it works today, and I think it will work into the future as long as, some of the players are the same and that open line of communication is in place as well. That could be said with myself and the HR director choosing those individuals from the community as well, based on what is, the background. That can be questioned as well. So, and I know the perspective would be slightly possibly different, but I understand what you're saying.
I guess what I'm getting at is for those types of examinations or just community panel component, I would like to see that 2 out of 3 and the 2 mandatorily the candidate ought to pass as a professional and internal panel. Community panel, I mean, this is a great community. There's great people here with great qualifications, education or life experiences, but to identify one that can really, for example, to sit and say, great captain makes she or he, there's a select few perhaps in the city that would know what it takes to do that. Sure. So,
and I believe the weighting then comes into play in terms of how the panels are weighted. And each bulletin is possibly slightly different, but that's where the weighting can possibly come in.
Yeah, and we'll talk about that the next item. Thank you.
Mr. Devine? Mr. Gary?
There's been a lot of discussion here today about how we trust or not trust. I mean, I want to make sure that there is no question that the Civil Service Commission I personally trust Mr. Doyle and the staff 100%. It's not like we haven't had a human resources director who was basically all hands-on with no one saying anything. So when we talk about what we should be doing, we're not talking about what we should be doing while Mr. Doyle and this staff is here. We're talking about what we should be doing while, if Mr. Doyle and the staff decides to quit tomorrow and bring somebody new in here that we don't even know, that person should be able to follow that exact same the process. So I don't want there to be any discussion in reference to how we feel about the human resources or their staff or Mr. Doyle or anyone else. We're just trying to put together a process where we are not a rubber stamp, like some people have said. We will never be a rubber stamp, and we will do what we need to do regardless of the pressures that some will put on us.
Just one or two questions, Ms. Beers. You are not suggesting, and this addresses Mr. Abkarian's comment about the Civil Service Commission and our obligation under the charter are somewhat different from other commissions within the city. You're not suggesting in any way that we mandate the use of community panels in the selection, because one of the bits of conversation here is that there is a little bit of fluidity, for good or for bad, within the civil service rules. We don't have specifics in terms of outlining in any regulation the composition of an internal panel versus the composition of an external panel. All that has grown over the course of time in the experience of multiple city managers. So at this point, you're not suggesting to us that tonight, as a motion, we mandate that selection of all executives must be via a community panel selected by members, the composition of which selected by members of council.
No, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very appreciated. Thank you. All right. At this point, what I do want to do is that we have, does that satisfy Mr. Manukian? Do you have any other questions, any other witnesses that you would want to?
No, I'll let you know if I do.
Thank you. I'm sure you will. Deputy, would you read back what we called at the outset recommendations? We'll go and address them one by one.
Mr. Chair, with your permission, I think I would like to do that instead.
Oh, that's fine. Perfect. I'm sure that you would defer to our Assistant City Attorney.
I want to before we go there, I want to withdraw my recommendation that we discuss the lunches. I think that I made my point. I think everyone understands what the point is. So I want to go ahead and withdraw that, unless anyone else feels strongly about that. I think we've killed that word as much as we could, and I think the point has been made. So that we don't need to discuss.
And so with that, we've identified 3 specific items that were discussed in the form of recommendation. We believe one of them could be voted on tonight. The other 2 warrant some additional discussion either tonight or at some later meeting. The first being the amendment to the conflict of interest form. The specific language was proposed by Commissioner Gazarian.
I second that.
Yeah.
All right, there's a motion and a second. At this time, I'll entertain any discussion, and that's a revision of the conflict of interest form, which the assumption being that conflict of interest form is in fact a form generally circulated, Mr. Doyle, across the entire Glendale City employees.
Yes, sir.
Civil service. Okay. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Hearing none, let's call.
Commissioner Manukian?
Yes.
Commissioner
I'm
Perry?
sorry, forgive me, point of order. Shouldn't the revision be first identified so that people know what they're voting for?
That's fine. I thought that that's very good. We can again articulate that. I thought that the Assistant City Attorney did a very fine job, but we'll again, if you could read that back, and if we have any technical amendments, let's do it.
No, we do need to have the specific language, which we
That's
can
true.
play back the recording and transcribe. So we don't need to. I mean, if you'd like to read it into the record, you may.
I would. I would actually, because I
That is your motion, I believe.
It is, yes. So my specific language I'm proposing is, have you ever been a witness or a party to any dispute, complaint, claim, an administrative or legal action involving any candidate, and following up with the language that exists on all the other
You're going
questions.
too fast if you really want them to write it down.
Oh, somebody writing it down? I thought it was just for the recorder.
Just for the record, we'll play it back.
The next time, we're going to ask Mr. Doyle for
going to write
a
it down. I
reporter.
said, what are you doing?
Doesn't
Yeah.
short
Not transcribers.
It was.
All right. If you could,
I'll start over
again,
again.
try.
Have you ever
A
been
bit slower, please.
Have you ever been a witness or a party to any dispute, complaint, claim, an administrative or legal action involving any candidate or a member of a candidate's immediate or extended family or by marriage? Question mark.
You lost me at hello.
All
Yes.
right. Is there still a second to
There's still
that?
a
There's still a second.
Yes, there is still some.
Are the members of the commission comfortable with the recitation of the motion?
Yes.
Yes.
With that acclamation, then we'll put it to a vote.
Commissioner Manukian?
Yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Yes.
Mr. Chair, members of the commission, the second item that was proposed by Commissioner Abkarian was the removal from the oral rating sheet an overall likelihood of success category that was identified as number 7. Just in sitting here and in our cursory review of the civil service rules, we've identified at least one place where that particular item is mentioned. We would need to review that further to see if there are any other places where that's mentioned.
Why don't I do my motion could we have this as a report for the next Civil Service Commission meeting, so we can then discuss it and vote on that particular item?
Is that the consensus again of the commission? We'll frame that, once again, we'll take a vote, but that will be a directive to staff to come forth, staff and city attorney, HR and staff.
For the record, so that we're fluid, I'll second the motion and then go.
Commissioner Manukian?
For a report?
Yeah.
Yeah, for a report, yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Yes. And third, ma'am?
The third item was brought forth by Commissioner Devine, and we understood that his request was that internal panels in the future be made up by executive or members of management, and that we provide a report specific to that. Am I correct?
All right. Is it clear to the my fellow commissioners as to the proposal?
Report to come back on that particular item. Yeah, I second that.
All right. Any further discussion? Seeing none, call the question.
Commissioner Manukian?
For a report, yes.
Commissioner Abkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Kazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Yes. I would solicit from my commissioners any sort of deadline and incorporate commentary from Mr. Doyle as to how quickly he can come back with that response. Do we want it in at our next meeting in January, or do we want to give him more
There's
liberal?
holidays.
Let's do February or March, so.
A meeting that I'm not.
Mr. Chair, it's
We may not be
not
at the commission
agendized,
by then
but
anyway.
January, I was going to ask whether the commission wished to have a meeting in January.
We can bring that
What
up.
day of the week is that?
It's a Wednesday.
What date?
Second Wednesday.
What date?
Bad.
Is that like
Wednesday
early
the
in
8th.
January?
And we have, it's the week right after New Year's, and there's
That's
gonna be-
January
You know what I'm
8th.
going to ask? Let's defer that to the end because we
Okay.
have a little bit more work to do. That's the administrative portion. All I'm looking for right now is a date, a suspense date.
90 days.
Report back.
I recommend 90 days.
Within 90 days.
I see all head nodding. It's an interesting way of getting a parliamentary approval. 90
because
days.
I won't be here.
Yeah.
No, you'll be here in 90 days.
Okay.
All right, Mr. Doyle, you report back in 90 days.
That's for the report, the
And
two
both
reports.
reports.
The OLA, the
Let's
overall-
defer everything for 90 days.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Okay,
All right.
the two reports.
All right. Everybody take a breath, or should we take a break?
No, we have one item.
We
Let's
have
just
one
go on.
item.
Let's do it.
All right. We'll proceed
break.
with that's no break. I hear
No
that from my
breaks.
So
commissioner.
much for losing weight. I'm supposed to be eating at 6 p.m. It's
Don't
8,
worry
8
about it.
p.m. now.
You have plenty to
I wanna
reserve. Plenty of
No, I'm trying
reserves.
to lose the weight. Go ahead.
All right.
All right, so do I, sir.
All right. Besides your health condition, we're going to move forward to agenda item.
12, job
Yes.
for approval, police captain.
Move to approve.
We've read it. Mr. Doyle, give us a shorter version.
Short version, this is a promotional safety bulletin per the rules that must come before you. this bulletin is fully consistent with the approved class spec for police captain. The topic for discussion, which always comes up, is the selection process. What's being proposed is a model that somewhat mimics our what we've used, Ms. Beers referred to, in several of our executive recruitments, with a proffessional panel, an internal panel, and a community panel. The proposed weightings would be 40% for the professional panel, 30% for a community panel, and 30% for the internal organization panel, and that the internal organization panel consists of City of Glendale executives and upper management employees, as well as employee association representatives. With that, this item does require commission approval, in whatever format you choose. Chief Povolitis is here if you have any specific questions or want to get his.
Mr. Chief, if you could come forward for a brief summary of your action item.
I think Mr. Doyle, Carl Povolitis, Chief of Police. I think Mr. Doyle just did the briefest summary that you.
Well, we'll give you all of 60 seconds, sir.
Okay. Yes, we are before you today to request approval of a job bulletin for police captain. I have a police captain that's going to retire here, I think, in less than 2 weeks, and now I have a need to fill that position. I will tell you that, as I've told a lot of people, I'm a believer in old-fashioned police work, but I also know that we work in a modern world. And so as we go through this process, it's like, the process that we would have used in 1990 would not be the process I would recommend today. And so looking forward at what the department needs now and what I think it will need into the future, we're proposing a process that is a little bit different than has been utilized in the past, but I think it's one that would ultimately help me get 3 candidates and get the appropriate viewpoints on the various candidates, because I think I'll have a very competitive pool, but get appropriate viewpoints on those candidates. And so, as I said, that proposal is to have a professional panel, a community panel, and an internal organizational panel. Very briefly, I will tell you I think there are 4 things that I think I'm really looking for in the next police captain. Number 1 is I need them to be able to run a division of this police department, and I need some people to help assess me in making that assessment, and that would be a professional panel of other police officers. Their job is to assess whether they have the ability to run a division in the department, whether they can represent me, whether they have basically the complete professional acumen to do that. I think the second part of that is, look, Glendale is a very unique community, especially when I talk to my colleagues. We work with other departments in order to accomplish what we do. It is not the police department alone. Whether it is working with human resources, whether it is working with the finance department, our homeless outreach team is working with community services and parks. We're routinely working with my brothers and sisters in public safety in the fire department, and we are able to accomplish a lot because of that. So the second thing I need out of that captain is someone who can work effectively with those other departments. Those partnerships are critical, the ability to do that. Obviously, this is a good-sized police department, and it is a good-sized city, and that keeps me relatively busy, which means I need to be able to delegate to those individuals and have them work through the operational ends of that and be successful and build effective partnerships and effective operations within the city. The third thing, and probably as I'm kind of going in descending order of importance for me, is the community. It's an important role, but being able to, we're steeped in the traditions of community policing. So having relationships with the community, continuing to build those relationships with the community, I really am not joking when I say you're never done with that. As I said, I've been around this city a little while. I snuck over 29 years. So I've watched the community change, but I also know that I'm getting older and that, my peers are getting older within the community. There is a younger generation that is stepping up. For us to be successful as an organization in the future, we need people who are connecting with that younger generation to prepare us to go forward. So there is that role, and so that's a viewpoint that would be helpful in assessing me. And the last thing, as I said, old-fashioned policing, but absolutely modern world. The world has changed, and the style of management has changed, and I need captains to be able to work with our associations. In this community, which again, different from some of my other colleagues, we enjoy good working relationships, but that's a perspective because I won't be here all the time. And when issues arise as to personnel, MOUs, things that come up, I won't say daily, but on a fairly frequent basis, I need someone who's be able to effectively work with that. And while not a majority, I think that perspective helps me make a decision because ultimately, at the end of this process, 3 candidates for the position are going to come to me. And for me, then it's like, I now need to figure out what is the best fit for what I call the executive team for that police department for us to be effective going forward. And that means I'm going to be looking for people who can complement my skill sets so that we're effective as a department. And with that, I'll stop.
Any questions?
No, I just have comments.
Okay, wait, comments or questions? That's fine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now, I mean, personally, I think the idea of having the associations having a seat on that table is an excellent idea. The captain's position is a very important position in the police department. It is a leadership position that has a major impact on the operations of the department and the relationship overall with the community. In addition to having experience, leadership skills, you also have to have the ability and to work with the associations. You also have to have the respect of your fellow officers. I think that's one of the things that is very unique to our police department. The guy next to you has to trust you. And that is something that throughout the organization, it's not enough just to be able to get a ranking. You also have to have their respect. And some of that is built up through the association. And I've always, said the chief and the command staff should have the ability to pick the individuals that are the most qualified, because they're the ones who really know what it takes to do that job. I mean, I can stand here and pretend that I know what it takes to become a good captain, but at the end of the day, the individuals that are within the association, those individuals are part of this organization. They know what it takes, and their perspective, I think, is important into the overall process. So I think it's a great idea.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Doyle, your report on page 49 says that the Glendale Management Association has been given an opportunity to review the job bulletin. Comments and input from the GMA have been incorporated into the draft. Now, I've seen three versions of this. One version is Management Association has been contacted. They have not expressed any concern. Management Association has been contacted. As of the date of this bulletin, we haven't heard from them. Here you say comments and input. Just for you to think about, as I quickly go through a couple more things and I'm done. It's very short, my remarks. What comments and input, if any, were incorporated, I would like to know.
Certainly. Mr. Chair. Oh,
go ahead if you want to respond right now.
We do have a GMA senior representative present.
No, but I'd like to know what it is that the HR incorporated, if possible. If you know. If you don't, that's fine. I'm curious about that.
Oh, I know.
You better know. All right. But I have a more of a serious question. You want to answer this first?
Yes,
if you want? Go ahead.
Mr. Chair. As you recall, this item was on last month's on the November.
Yes.
And at that point, when the time of press or whatever we want to say, there were no comments. However, after it was published, I was contacted by Craig Hinckley, who's the GMA president, and we met as quickly as we possibly could to address the concerns raised. And the two things that I recall from that meeting, number one was a concern about discussion about whether performance evaluations of candidates would be part of the internal panel, which originally that was the intention. That issue was brought forward during that meeting. And even at some point in that meeting, I contacted Chief Povolitis. He came over, we talked it out, and he expressed his view in support of that. But I think collectively we agreed to withdraw that recommendation. The second part was Mr. Hinckley, there was discussion about involving the employee associations, and he asked, is that going to involve GMA as well, because it was always the intent of including GCEA and GPOA, who both fall within the police department. I have to say our initial thought was to not include GMA just because it essentially consists of the members of anyone applying for this job would be a GMA member, so it would make it a little difficult to select a panelist. At that point, Mr. Hinckley recommended that he would be in a position to serve as that person if we were to consider it. So I thought that was a fair point to raise, and thus that was the extent of our discussion. And Craig is here. If I hope I got that right.
And we will, if
I don't have a question.
No further questions?
I have no question from the gentleman, but
That's
I have
fine.
something else. Yes. The second and third. Well, let me address the third one. You say in the last page, page 53, you write, candidates must achieve a minimum passing score of 70% on each test component to have their names placed on the eligible list. Then it follows, the City of Glendale reserves the right to modify the above stated examination components and/or weights. Is this after the examination is given that it gets modified? How does that work?
Mr. Chair, Commissioner Gazarian, no. That is boilerplate language
Okay.
in case something were to come up at some point, and this would be prior to any examination.
Okay. All right.
And it's on every bulletin.
It is, and I
Okay.
don't even know.
I just wanted to know
I don't
that.
even know that we'd want to continue having that language, but it's a flexibility issue. But we certainly wouldn't conduct an examination and then decide after the fact to change the weights.
Okay.
So-
And my last question is to the chief, if I may, Chief. So in the selection process, what we have before us on page 53 talks about a professional panel with a weight of 40%, community panel weight of 30%, and an internal organization panel a weight of 30%.
That's correct.
I don't mind telling you that I find that troubling because you've been doing this for a long time in different capacities within the department, and I would have thought that in selecting an appropriate, highly qualified candidate to serve as a captain who would complement your skill set, to use your language, if you will, that the professional panel, which my understanding is it's made up of chiefs of polices from other departments, from other cities, would be best suited to know what the skill sets are to complement various police chiefs sitting there. To allocate them 40% seems to me that you may, Chief, you may be shortchanging yourself. I would like to see, and I don't know how Mr. Doyle feels about it, and I don't know how you folks got to this allocation, that a professional panel ought to be at least half the value of the testing process, if not more. So I don't want to sit here and say, and I'm not interested in negotiating with anybody, it's just these are my thoughts, that the professional panel ought to be at least 50%, if not more. The internal panel and the community panel, I think by now everybody knows my concerns, cannot be the same. An internal panel made up of management and folks within the city, other departments that are going to work with the police department the way our city works, as you said, Chief. I would think that they should have a bit more weight than the community panel, which will then, take us to the finish line, if you will. So I'd like to see how my fellow commissioners feel, how you, view a component, a setup where a professional is at least 50 or 60%. The internal panel is at 25% or 30%, and the community panel, of course, it's 20% at that point, depending on how you divide it up. But it should not, I don't see how you can have community panel and internal panel really be 60% of the grading examination of a captain who's going to complement the chief. That's my feeling on this, and thank you very much for listening. So if you have any...
What was the question?
It's a question and
but
a
I support
position.
your... just to let, but I don't know what, above 50%, that's a different thing, but I think.
I think he's soliciting commentary from the chief about the relative allocations of the scoring. And so, Chief, you've come up in collaboration with the various leaders within the city as to the percentages. And I think the question, if I could, Mr. Gazarian, is why did we select 40, 30, 30?
Because I'm not happy with 40. So I may not vote for 40. How's that? That's what I'm at.
Mr. Doyle may need to help me out here a little bit, but I think when we originally put this together in the process, we modeled it after some of the other recruitments that have been in the city, and this is sort of how it fell out. I think listening to your comments, and then even in my own sort of reflection of where I see the importance of things, as I said to me, number one is the professional panel. Number two becomes the city internal panel because of the relative weights of as I see the job function, and then third would be the community panel. So an adjustment into 50% on the community panel and some relative weighting, however that works out on the other, would be okay.
I think the reason forgive me, Chair, if I may respond. The reason I say it is because, in one sense, I suppose it doesn't matter. You can make the professional panel 10% and the rest 90%, because if a candidate fails any one portion, the candidate fails the exam. But I would think, in the end, when you get to have a selection out of perhaps the three most qualified individuals, that's where it would be of greater value that the grading and the weight allocated to the grading is given to the professional panel greater than the 40% that is reflected in this proposal. That's where I am.
And as I said, I suspect this will be I expect it's going to be a very competitive process. So the ability to assess candidates and, if you will, put some daylight in between them and get some perspectives on them is going to be important.
Mr. Doyle, do you have anything about this 40%?
Chair, Commissioner Gazarian, I do concur on the issue of the professional panel, and I mean, we're talking about police professionals above the level of captain, and I think your recommendation makes sense to put that at least 50%, and perhaps reduce the other two to
50, 30, 20.
You don't think the other two should be a bit slightly different than one another? For example, the internal panel 30% and the community panel 20%? Oh, as my fellow
50,
commissioner,
30, 20.
Mr. Manukian is suggesting. Because the internal panel are people that work here in the city, as opposed to me, somebody who lives in the city.
Yeah, again, it's not for me to lobby or to give my opinion, but I think either of those recommendations, 50, 25, 25, or 50, 20, 30 makes sense. But
that's for point of information. We have given discretion to Mr. Doyle for the determination as of now of these percentages. So we can either, in a sense, go directive, or we can merely put the suggestion forward to the chief and to Mr. Doyle, and in their discretion, they might reallocate those percentages before the beginning of the selection process.
Well, no, because we're going to vote on this, I
we
need to know
vote
what
on
they
it.
are, because I will tell you, I'm not inclined to vote in favor if it's 40% professional, for starters. I'm telegraphing it. I'm actually saying it.
Well, so that is the main area of contention, is that right,
Yes,
Mr. Gazarian?
and I would like to be satisfied as to why the other two have to be equal, when my explanation and my logic to me, unless someone convinces me otherwise, and I'm open-minded enough to be.
I might
hear that.
intervene, and I'm not sure if this is the province of the chair, but only to suggest that the allocation, if you put too great an emphasis on the professional panel, the external panel, there is a possibility that someone is selected who does not identify or understand the culture of this city. This city is beautiful, it's unique in its diversity, and that has to be taken into account. And that's why the emphasis, I believe, that was addressed by Mr. Doyle and the chief on both the internal assessment, where you have managers from across the city who have themselves some understanding of the peculiarities and the beauties of Glendale, the opportunities and the challenges can influence, and as well the community panel, from which we glean some understanding of the community's concern for policing. So I personally am comfortable with this. I can understand your dynamic, but I just think it opens up a possibility that we would get somebody, for instance, who has never set foot in Glendale, does not understand what it is like to live in this city, and would perhaps never find him or herself truly integrated into our department, which is one of the big considerations across the board when you bring forth a senior manager, senior leader in an organization, that person must work with both his superiors, Chief Povolitis, but as well be accepted by the rank and file. And if you get somebody from the outside and that person comes in and she has an agenda or he has an agenda that's derived from working in the East Coast, for instance, which has a whole set of different problems, we could create tremendous tension and create issues that at this point aren't there. So my view, and this is my view, is to hold at that number. And I hope I've provided you with a little bit of an explanation.
Well, actually, Mr. Chair, your explanation presupposes that somebody is coming in from the outside. We're promoting from within. Am I not correct?
Yeah.
So the examiner is coming from the outside as a professional, as a chief of police. I suppose is not coming from Alaska, he or she is coming from surrounding communities, and the professional panel's role is to select the professional that is best suited to be a captain. Now, you have the community panel that will provide whatever concern or nuance. We talk about the beautiful city that we live in. Great, that's fine. But that should not be the greater component of someone who is going to run a police department at the upper management level.
You certainly have my position vis-a-vis whether this is, and I acknowledge this is internal, but the same rationale applies. But that said, certainly because we are at the commission level, I should turn to Mr. Devine and his commentary and questions.
I have no questions.
Startling. Mr. Abkarian.
I have a couple of comments. First comment, I personally don't have any issues of going 50, 25, 25. By the way, I think 50, 25 or 50, 30, 20, in my opinion, would actually be a good idea, even though it really doesn't matter if you go 91, because if that 1% says that you're not going to get elected, it doesn't matter what the other 99% say. It's really a moot point as far as I'm concerned, because that 1% could say we don't want it. You can get 99%, you can get all 100% on the other two panels and don't pass that one panel and you're basically out. So this balancing act that we're playing here, saying everyone is equal, we're going to put this much, it really doesn't matter as far as I'm concerned. So the percentages really make no difference for me. You can give 1% to one panel, and if that panel says everyone gets 100% on the other two panels, let's let the public know. The other two panels, you get 100%. On the internal, you get 69%, you're done. You're not going to move forward. So
that'll just as I want to make sure I understand. You. So if you get 100% on the professional panel,
right,
and you get 100% on the internal panel,
on the community, then the internal says no. We go give you 69, then you're basically done.
Okay. Now, as far as
the percentages don't mean anything,
or the community says 69.
Or the community say we don't want it, then you're basically done. So this percentages is good when you actually move forward, but when it has to do with what we do as a whole, it really doesn't mean anything, because at the end of the day, if the internal panel or the community panel decide we don't like someone, that person is not getting in, even if they get 100% on the other two panels. Right. It means nothing.
Let me ask the chief.
So,
Mr. Abkarian, if I could, and the chief's commentary, would you? I get a sensing from the commissioners that they would see and would entertain a different percentage.
Yes.
May I finish?
Certainly.
My comments, if you don't mind? Because so that, and as far as the percentages goes, I'll go with whatever percentage you guys want, because at the end of the day, I think that it really doesn't matter. The crock of the thing is that the process itself has to be a valid process to ensure that you have a process that would basically provide a transparency and equal playing level to everyone. According to that, on a captain's position, I went to at least 8 different cities that are the same size, and not a single one has captain's position where the association will have some say in that particular captain's position. There's not even one. I couldn't find one. I don't think that there is even one that allowed the association to make comments on the captain's position. In reference to the police association, and I don't have any horse in this race, GCEA, I can understand having a member from another department that would be in there. That I wouldn't have any problem. GMA, there was a comment that GMA shouldn't be there. I think that the one organization that should have a lot of people there is GMA, because this person is going to be working with the management all the time. So GMA definitely should have representatives in there. One association that I have a problem with is the GPOA. There isn't one anywhere that would have this same setup. It would be the same as if you put a association member on a management position and try to do that. But on this one, I would have a problem having the GPOA actually be a part of the internal panel. I don't have a problem with the GMA. I don't have a problem with the association, which is outside, but to have the people that you're going to have make recommendations that would basically be fatal on that particular panel, which would basically make a decision as to what happens to you.
But why would the GPOA, just as a curiosity, why would we assume that the GPOA would?
No. I'm not talking about GPOA would say something. I'm just saying that they are the people. I've never seen the employees decide what the management should be or who the management should be. I've never seen it in any corporation or any company where you would actually have the employees decide who the management position, especially a management position to this level of captain, would be. It has never been done in any other organization. Right. No other police department does it. Accordingly, I wouldn't be in favor of GPOA being part of the internal. All the other ones that are not directly in employment position, so to speak, I don't have any problems with, especially GMA, but the GPOA would be in direct employment of that person, and that the people that they're going to basically manage are going to say who the manager should be. That's a popularity contest. That's not a actual decision as to who's best qualified to do the job. So that's my opinion.
All right. So the chair hears 2 recommendations. One is that the percentages are reallocated. The second is as to the composition of the internal panel.
Yes, but I'd like, with your permission, to clarify something Commissioner Abkarian said. I've been in the city for some time, and I was not even on the commission, I believe. I know I wasn't. But I do recall that a particular chief of police who was interviewed, there was a member of the GPOA who sat on that interview of the chief of police. Now, this is not a chief of police interview. This is a captain interview. That I do know for a fact, and I don't know if it's important for me to name the chief at the time who that was, or the person who sat on it. I know both. I know their identities. That is. But having said that, it kind of, you know what it is, Commissioner Abkarian and fellow commissioners. It kind of, I understand where you're coming from. At the same time, I'm thinking, well, I kind of would want the 200 or so rank and file to decide or to have a say-so as to who would be one of their leaders, because I certainly don't want a mutiny. But this is, but at the same time, I thought that when I saw the conflict of interest questionnaire and and with everyone's concurrence, we amended to add the conflict of interest component. I dare say that there would be decent individuals within each and every management association.
That was going to be my question.
That would be qualified to sit and give an input. I'm not, to quote a former city manager, I'm not going to die on the hill, not this one. I'm not going to die on the hill on this issue. Okay, it's not that important to me. But in terms of intellectual discussion, it's important for us to note the benefits versus the concerns.
Fellow commissioners, with that, to provide a bit of structure, I think firstly we should ask for any commentary or response from the chief as to the suggestions. We can then, what I'm proposing is that we first put forward a motion to approve the bulletin, and then if Mr. Abkarian or you, Mr. Gazarian, or any other member of this commission wants to suggest an amendment to that, the amendment could be as to the percentages, the amendment could be as to the composition, then we have a structured motion.
I reject your proposal, Mr. Chair, respectfully, because if you put the item to be approved and then I make a proposal and it doesn't carry, I just now approved an item that I don't believe it should be approved as is. So I would suggest you consider that a discussion be had, an amendment motion be made, and if it carries or doesn't carry, then I know how to vote.
Well, that's exactly the format, because we vote on the amendments before we vote on the main motion.
Okay, then I
That's how we work.
Then
All right, so with that, we have commentary from the chief.
I'll just make, I think, a couple of quick comments. Just in terms of overall structure on how we've structured recruitments over time is generally we have given a community and internal panel equal weight. They both have a differing perspective, but something that's important. So I think that's just important to kind of put on the table for at least your consideration of what we've historically done in the city. And then, as I said, although this is a bit of a different process, association involvement is yet but one voice on a much larger panel. So there's not a panel of associations to say something, because I'm very sensitive to the same things. I've gone before panels, and associations have actually sat on them for when I tested for a chief spot. So I've been in that spot, so I understand. But it is one thing. And just to be very clear, we also have GCA working within the building. Our professional staff, for the most part, is GCA.
Thank you.
I wanted to just get a quick clarification. We're talking about, first of all, in my opinion, the GPOA should be on this, on there, absolutely, in my opinion, because I think they're one of the most qualified to know what it takes to do this job. Number two, is it my understanding correct that we're talking about, let's say if the GPOA was going to be on that panel, they would assign an individual as one member of, it wouldn't be all GPOA, correct? Correct?
That's correct. They would be one member of a larger panel.
If I could clarify, the intent would be for there to be probably 5 executives on this panel, and then one representative each of GCA, GPOA, and GMA. So even if someone were to have some ill motives amongst one of these employee associations, they certainly wouldn't be able to, outnumber the other people in the room.
Got it. Thank you.
All right. With that, as in my capacity as chair, I'm going to entertain the first. We'll sequence as I suggested to you, Commissioner Gazarian. I recommend that we first make a motion to approve the bulletin and then entertain the amendments. Yeah, 1 and 2.
See, that's why I said I will not do that.
Well, I think only structure-wise, we have to do it in this way from a parliamentary procedure standpoint.
It's with the amendments.
Let's make the first motion.
Mr. Chair, if I may suggest, I think the argument is that they would like to see if the other items are approved before agreeing to approve the bulletin.
As I suggested and indicated, we first put on the table the motion to approve, but we don't vote on it. We do not vote. And incorporating exactly what you say, once we have the motion, then we have the 2 amendments, and then we vote. You want the amendment? yes, we don't want the amendment, the next amendment, and then finally we get to,
I
if
see.
the amendments are approved, then the motion changes by reason of that. That's the mechanical piece. So
Let me make it a little bit easier so we only considering one motion.
All right.
With the explanation of Mr. Doyle and the chief, I'm going to withdraw my motion in reference to not having GPOA in the actual. So unless if anyone else objects to it.
All right, so I will put forth the first motion, that is we approve the bulletin. I'd really like to get a second, then we get the amendment.
Second.
Okay, we don't vote on it. Now there's an amendment.
I move to amend the bulletin and reallocate, having heard the chief's input. Thank you for your input. Having heard the concerns of Commissioner Apkarian, I'd like to reallocate, despite that notion that any one section fails a candidate, I want the department to have a greater allocation of grading that provides a greater likelihood of good qualified candidates. With that, I'd like to reallocate 50% for the professional, 25% for the internal, and 25% for the community.
Second.
Having heard the chief's concerns.
We have a motion to amend and a second, and that's an actionable amendment. And any discussion?
So
Hearing
we're going
none.
to vote on
The amendment first.
Amendment first.
Amendment first. If the amendment passes, then the motion is indeed amended. All right. Call for the question, sir.
Commissioner Manukian?
Yes, as amended.
Commissioner Apkarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Gazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
No. All right, now we have the motion for the bulletin as amended, and that is to approve the bulletin with the allocations as enunciated in the amendment.
Okay.
So
So
we have
the
a-
bulletin along with the.
That is
amendment
correct,
we just-
absolutely. Call the question. Oh, is there any further discussion? I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. No further discussion? Call.
Commissioner Manukian?
I'm voting based on the motion with the amendment.
That's correct.
Okay, which we just did right before.
Right.
Okay,
So, yes.
okay, yeah.
Commissioner Apkarian?
That is?
Yes.
Commissioner Gazarian?
Yes.
Commissioner Devine?
Yes.
Chair McCarley?
Yes. All right, we have approval. Now, take a
Move to
breath.
adjourn.
Yeah.
I have to get back to the office.
No, you're not supposed to leave.
No,
We
no,
have
no.
a bit more. You've been here this long.
Bye.
No lunch for you.
All right, why don't we get to something sedate, like past due and
Report?
evaluations, right?
Mr. Chair, the report looks good.
Do we
Move
want
to adjourn.
Yeah, there is. Civil service comments? No comments. We've talked all night. I would second that motion to adjourn.
Good night.
The maximum load, how is it going to be handled? It's very difficult with few renderings to give positive comments on the design. This is a very large project. It will take a little bit of time to take it in and observe it. And so, but as far as the parking goes, we have most of our large events in Hilton. Hilton is a go-to place in Glendale. And sometimes you come in and there is no room in the parking garage, South Park. You want to valet backed up on Glen Oaks already.
Mm-hmm.
If you're traveling west on Glen Oaks, try to make that left onto the parking, the entrance to Hilton. Good luck to you, because the east side traffic is already backed up, queuing on Glen Oaks, and everybody's coming in. And you add another 800 to 1,000 cars to that traffic, I don't care who's doing that traffic study, is not going to make it pencil out as to how you're going to manage that traffic. How many, you need to have enough parking spaces to even valet everybody. And that will take, we were at an event at Hilton in Beverly Hills, 1,000 people showed up, right? And how long was the valet line? It was like an hour and a half to get your car. And they have this huge queuing area that you can queue 100 cars, maybe more. So I think this is something that needs to be really, truly looked at. The design, I love this glass tall buildings. It's my line, my type of buildings. I like these high-rise buildings. The other thing is most of our high-rise buildings that are up against the property line in downtown area, they have very wide sidewalks. They don't have a 4-foot wide sidewalk. The sidewalks are very, very wide. So when you walk around, you don't feel that imposing style of that tower standing around on top of your head. And downtown is a little bit different because the streets are maybe a little bit narrower, the sidewalks are wider. I think that needs to be looked at. And I know your restrictions on this because you're right up against the Vertigo Wash and you cannot build over it. So,
can I address that real quick? Because something that probably wasn't that I didn't address is that along the ground level, we have we reviewed the DSP, and we're able to comply along the ground level with the elements of the DSP, and that is we are actually enhancing the area, I like to think, because we will have a 4-foot parkway that essentially goes along Brand, along Glen Oaks, in front of the tower itself, and then actually sweeps around for up into where our service entrance is. We were adding a 4-foot parkway along that area. And then with the DSP, what it required for our particular zone, correct me if I'm wrong, it was a 6-foot wide sidewalk minimum. We're able to address the 6-foot. And then now over 90% of the tower frontage actually has no less than 5 to 7 feet, sometimes 9 feet, 10 foot worth of a landscape belt to the right against the tower. Our tower doesn't actually come back to the property line until we're 28 to 30 feet above grade. And at no point do we ever encroach on the sidewalk. It's all held back behind our property line. So when you're walking along that pedestrian level, it's something that we've had experience with. We want people to be able to walk down there without being blasted by a bunch of heat from glass. So it's been softened quite a bit.
Thank you. I have, sorry?
What's the setback?
It says 4 feet.
What does it add up to?
The narrowest part, which is in front of a staircase on Glen Oaks, is 10 feet per the DSP.
But then it gets wider?
It does get wider for a majority of the tower, actually, considerably wider.
It's 10 feet from the curb.
Correct.
Right? It's
Yeah.
10 feet from the curb. It's not 10 feet from the property line.
That's correct.
Yeah, it's 4 feet
Yeah.
from the property line, 6-foot wide sidewalk.
And the DSP was actually very clear as to how we needed to address and where those lines needed to be.
Okay, I have some questions from staff. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very
I
much.
really am looking forward to have a Class A hotel. Ever since I got elected, I was looking for one. If it's a Meridian or I agree with Mr. Our Mayor Najarian that it has to be a high-end brand in order for us to try to make this work.
Wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Some questions from staff.
I have one more.
Before
No
you
answer.
if you can come back, Mr. Hicks, before you sit down, I just have a question. Have you seen the conditions and comments that staff has given you?
Yes,
the nine?
we've worked.
Are you
closely
okay with those?
I don't think I've seen anything that we couldn't manage at some point.
Okay, because part of our motion is going to be, if it's approved, approving it with these conditions that staff has given you. So
Can I take a look at that just real quick?
I hope you've seen them.
Yeah. I was gonna say, I'd like to commit to something from the other side.
I don't think it's very.
Dennis, has he